This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I was so excited for our weekend getaway in the mountains. My 3 best friends and I had been planning this trip for months, desperate to escape the city and unwind in nature. We found this picturesque cabin online, secluded, surrounded by pine trees, with breathtaking views of the snow-capped peaks. It seemed perfect. The drive up was full of laughs and singing along to our road trip playlist. As we wound our way up the mountain roads, the anticipation built. Finally, after what felt like hours of hairpin turns, we spotted the wooden cabin nestled in a small clearing. "There it is!" shouted Mike from the back seat. We all cheered as I pulled the car up the gravel driveway. But our excitement quickly turned to confusion as we noticed a beat-up pickup truck already parked outside. "That's weird," I thought. The owner said we'd have the place to ourselves. "Maybe it's the cleaning staff?" suggested Sarah optimistically. We grabbed our bags and approached the front door. Before we could even knock, it swung open. A tall, gaunt man with wild gray hair and a scraggly beard stood in the doorway. He glared at us with piercing blue eyes. "Can I help you?" he growled. We all froze, taken aback. I fumbled for words. Hi there. We rented this cabin for the weekend. There must be some mistake." The man's scowl deepened. "No mistake. This is my home. Always has been." A chill ran down my spine. Something about this guy felt very off. Mike stepped forward, trying to diffuse the tension. "Sir, we have a confirmation email. Maybe there was a booking error? We'd be happy to call the owner and sort this out." The man's eyes flashed with anger. "I told you this is my home. Now get off my property before I make you leave." He took a menacing step towards us. We all instinctively backed away. Okay, I said, holding up my hands. "We're leaving. No trouble." We hurried back to the car, throwing anxious glances over our shoulders. The man stood in the doorway, watching us with that unsettling stare. Once inside the car, we all let out a collective breath. "What the hell was that about?" whispered Sarah. "I don't know, but that guy gave me the creeps," said Mike. "Should we call the police?" I shook my head. "And say what? Some weird guy is in the cabin we rented? We don't even know if he's actually trespassing." "Well, we can't just leave," insisted Sarah. "We drove all this way, and we already paid for the rental." We debated back and forth for a while. None of us wanted to confront the man again, but we also didn't want to give up on our vacation. Finally, we decided to wait it out. Maybe he would leave on his own. We had enough snacks and blankets to spend the night in the car if needed. As darkness fell, we kept a wary eye on the cabin. Occasionally, we'd see the man's shadowy figure pass by a window. It was unnerving, knowing he was in there, possibly watching us too. Sleep did not come easy that night. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf had us on edge. What if he decided to come after us in the night? I must have eventually dozed off, because the next thing I knew, bright sunlight was streaming through the car windows. I rubbed my eyes and looked towards the cabin. The pickup truck was gone. We cautiously approached the cabin. The front door was unlocked. Inside, there was no trace that anyone had been there recently. No luggage, no food in the fridge, just clean, generic rental furniture. "Maybe we imagined the whole thing," said Mike with a nervous laugh. But we all knew that wasn't true. The encounter had been far too vivid, too terrifying to be a shared hallucination. We tried to salvage our weekend, hiking the trails and admiring the mountain vistas. But there was an undercurrent of tension the whole time. We found ourselves constantly looking over our shoulders. half expecting to see that wild-eyed man emerge from the woods. On our last night, we were sitting around the fireplace trying to relax. Suddenly, we heard the distinct sound of a vehicle coming up the road. We all froze, exchanging panicked looks. Was he coming back? The engine got louder and louder. My heart was pounding out of my chest. This was it. He had returned to finish whatever he started. The sound peaked as headlights swept across the windows, and then faded as the car continued past the cabin. We all let out relieved laughs, but the fear didn't fully subside. For the rest of the night, every little noise had us on edge. When it was finally time to leave the next morning, we couldn't pack up fast enough. As beautiful as the scenery was, we couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of some lingering presence. On the drive home, we tried to make sense of what happened. Who was that man? Why was he in our rental cabin? How did he disappear so quickly, leaving no trace behind? We came up with all sorts of theories. Maybe he was a squatter or a fugitive hiding out in empty vacation rentals. Perhaps he was the ghost of a former owner, or even a demon trying to lure in victims. But deep down, we knew we'd probably never get answers. I still think about that weekend sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment late at night and hear an unexpected noise, or when I'm hiking a secluded trail and feel like someone's watching me from the trees. That man's cold blue eyes and menacing scowl are seared into my memory. The terror of those moments when we realized we were isolated in the mountains with a potentially dangerous stranger. The sleepless night in the car, jumping at every sound. I've never felt so vulnerable, so utterly defenseless. It was a harsh reminder of how quickly a fun getaway can turn into a nightmare. How thin the veneer of safety and civilization really is. I'd like to say the experience brought our friend group closer together, that we bonded over this shared trauma. But the truth is, it created a rift. We never did another trip like that. Whenever someone suggested a weekend away, there were always excuses. I still love nature and try to get out hiking when I can, but I'll never rent a remote cabin again. The mountains lost some of their magic for me that weekend. Now, when I look at those majestic peaks, I can't help but wonder what other dark secrets they might be hiding. I was so excited for my solo backpacking trip through rural Vietnam. After months of planning and saving up, I had finally made it to the small village of Trang An, known for its stunning limestone karsts and scenic boat tours through flooded cave systems. As my taxi dropped me off at the village entrance, I took in the lush green surroundings and felt a sense of adventure coursing through me. The locals greeted me warmly as I walked down the main dirt road, waving and smiling. An elderly woman gestured for me to come look at her fruit stand, insisting I try some of the exotic dragon fruit and rambutan. Her wrinkled face beamed as I sampled the sweet flesh. "You like? Very good, yes?" she said in broken English. I nodded enthusiastically. A group of children ran up to me, giggling and pointing at my large backpack. They tugged at my sleeves, urging me to follow them. Come see, they chanted. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and I let them lead me down a narrow path away from the main village area. As we walked, I noticed how quiet it had become. The sounds of the village faded away, replaced by chirping birds and buzzing insects. The path wound through dense jungle, the leaves so thick they blocked out most of the sunlight. I started to feel a bit uneasy. "Where are we going?" I asked the children, but they just grinned and kept walking. After about 15 minutes, we emerged into a small clearing. In the center was a dilapidated wooden structure that looked like it might have once been a house or shed. The children pointed excitedly. "Look inside, many treasures," one boy said. Something felt off. Why would there be treasures in an abandoned shack in the middle of the jungle? But the children's eager faces made me hesitate to refuse. Cautiously, I approached the structure and peered inside the doorway. It was dark and musty. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out piles of discarded items strewn about. Old clothing, bags, shoes. With a jolt, I realized they all looked like tourists' belongings. A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't right. I turned to leave, but the children were suddenly blocking the doorway. Their innocent smiles had been replaced with cold, calculating looks that seemed out of place on their young faces. "You stay," one girl said firmly. Heart racing, I pushed past them and stumbled out of the shack. But as I tried to run, my foot caught on something. I looked down to see a thin wire stretched across the path, a tripwire. In that moment of distraction, strong hands grabbed me from behind. "No more running," a deep voice growled in my ear. I struggled against the iron grip, panic rising in my chest. This couldn't be happening. How could I have been so naive? More men emerged from the jungle, surrounding me. Their eyes glinted with malice. "Another foolish tourist," one sneered. "You people make it too easy." My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. These people, even the children, had clearly been working together to lure in unsuspecting travelers like myself. But for what purpose? Robbery? Ransom? Or something even worse? I didn't want to find out. With a surge of adrenaline, I stomped hard on my captor's foot and threw my head back, connecting with his nose. His grip loosened just enough for me to wrench free. I took off running, crashing through the underbrush. Shouts erupted behind me as they gave chase. Branches whipped at my face and thorns tore at my clothes. But I didn't slow down. My lungs burned as I gasped for air, legs pumping furiously. I had no idea where I was going, just that I had to get away. I could hear them gaining on me. They knew this jungle far better than I did. Just as I was about to lose hope, I burst out of the tree line and found myself on a dirt road. A beat-up old truck was approaching. Without thinking, I ran into the middle of the road, waving my arms frantically. The truck screeched to a halt, the driver leaning out and yelling something in Vietnamese. I didn't understand the words, but the concern on his face was clear. "Help! Please!" I gasped out between ragged breaths. I glanced behind me to see my pursuers emerging from the jungle. They hesitated when they saw the truck. The driver's eyes widened as he took in the scene. He gestured for me to get in, and I scrambled into the passenger seat. We peeled away in a cloud of dust, just as the men started running towards us again. As we sped down the road, my heart still pounding, I tried to explain what had happened to the driver. He nodded grimly, seeming unsurprised. He pointed to himself and said, "Min," then gestured for me to give my name. "Jack," I replied shakily. "Thank you, Min. You saved my life." Min drove me to the nearest city with a police station. As I recounted my experience to the officers, they exchanged knowing looks. Apparently, I wasn't the first tourist to fall victim to this scheme. They had been trying to catch this group for months, but the remote location made it difficult. I spent the next few days giving statements and helping the police put together descriptions of the people involved. They assured me they would increase patrols in the area and work on shutting down this operation. But I knew those promises wouldn't erase the terrifying memories. That night in my hotel room, I lay awake for hours, unable to shake the feeling of those cold hands grabbing me, the malicious glint in the children's eyes. How quickly my dream trip had turned into a nightmare. I had been so excited to immerse myself in the local culture, but my trust and naivety had almost cost me everything. The next morning, I booked the first flight home. As the plane took off, I gazed out the window at the lush landscape below. Vietnam was undoubtedly beautiful, but it now held a darkness I couldn't ignore. I knew the experience would haunt me for a long time to come. In the years since, I've continued to travel, but never again alone. I'm much more cautious now, always researching extensively and sticking to well-traveled areas. But no matter where I go, I can't help but wonder if danger is lurking just beneath the surface of those warm smiles and friendly faces. That day in the jungle opened my eyes to a harsh reality. Sometimes the most picturesque places hide the darkest secrets. I was lucky to escape with my life, but the scars remain. Now when I see news stories of tourists going missing in remote areas, I shudder, knowing all too well how easily it can happen. I still have nightmares sometimes, reliving those terrifying moments. The feeling of helplessness, of realizing too late that I'd walked right into a trap. In my dreams, I don't always make it out alive, but I try not to let the fear control me. I remind myself that for every bad experience, there are countless positive ones. The kindness of strangers like Min, who risked his own safety to help me. The diligent police officers working to make their country safer for visitors. Still, I can't help but wonder about that village. Are they still luring in unsuspecting tourists? How many others have fallen victim since I escaped? I hope the authorities were able to put a stop to it, but a part of me fears it's still happening, deep in that jungle where few dare to venture. My experience serves as a stark reminder that paradise isn't always what it seems. Behind the breathtaking vistas and warm hospitality can lurk very real dangers. It's a lesson I learned the hard way, one that will stay with me for the rest of my life. So if you're planning a trip off the beaten path, remember my story. Stay alert, trust your instincts, and never let your guard down completely. Because sometimes the most idyllic destinations can hide the darkest intentions. I was beyond excited for my tropical getaway. After months of grueling work and stress, I had splurged on a week at an exclusive luxury resort on a remote island in the Caribbean. The brochures promised pristine beaches, world-class amenities, and the ultimate in relaxation. As my plane descended toward the small island airport, I gazed out at the turquoise waters and lush jungle, feeling my worries start to melt away already. The resort's private shuttle picked me up from the airport. As we drove along winding coastal roads, the driver kept up a steady stream of chatter about the island's history and attractions. But something about his overly cheerful tone struck me as forced. I brushed it off as travel fatigue clouding my perception. When we pulled up to the resort entrance, I was struck by how deserted it seemed for peak tourist season. A pair of staff members greeted me with wide smiles, whisking away my luggage. "Welcome to paradise," they chirped in unison. Their enthusiasm felt rehearsed, almost manic. A vague sense of unease crept over me as I followed them into the grand open-air lobby. At the check-in desk, the clerk's smile never reached her eyes as she handed me my room key. "We hope you enjoy your stay with us," she said flatly. "Please don't hesitate to contact the front desk if you need anything at all." Something in her tone made me feel she was silently urging me to do the opposite. As I made my way to my beachfront bungalow, I noticed how eerily quiet the resort grounds were. No other guests lounging by the pool or strolling the manicured paths, just staff members who would freeze and stare as I passed before resuming their tasks with robotic efficiency. My room was luxurious, with a stunning ocean view, but small details felt off. The fruit basket on the table contained pieces that were clearly artificial. The local art on the walls was mass-produced prints I'd seen in chain hotels. When I tried the phone to call the front desk, there was no dial tone. That first afternoon, I tried to shake off my growing paranoia by heading to the beach. But the sand felt gritty and unnatural under my feet. The waves lapping at the shore sounded tinny and artificial, like a looped sound effect. When I peered out at the horizon, the ocean and sky seemed to blur together unnaturally, as if I were looking at a backdrop. I decided to get a drink at the tiki bar, hoping some alcohol might calm my nerves. The bartender's movements were stiff and awkward as he mixed my Mai Tai. When I took a sip, it tasted like chemicals. I discreetly dumped it in a planter when he wasn't looking. As evening fell, ominous storm clouds began to gather. The air grew thick and oppressive. Back in my room, I flipped on the TV, desperate for a distraction. Every channel showed the same eerie loop of smiling tourists enjoying resort activities. I quickly shut it off. Around 9 p.m., the skies opened up. Rain lashed against my windows as thunder boomed. The power flickered, then went out completely. In the pitch darkness, I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight. To my horror, it was completely dead despite being fully charged earlier. Lightning briefly illuminated my room, and in that flash, I saw a figure standing in the corner. I scrambled back against the headboard, heart pounding. When the next lightning strike came, the figure was gone, but now I could hear whispers and shuffling movements just outside my door. Panic rising, I quietly slipped out onto my private patio. Rain soaked me instantly as I peered into the darkness. More shadowy figures darted between the palm trees. Their movements were unnatural, almost insectile. I knew I had to get off this island immediately. I set off toward where I thought the docks were, stumbling through the muddy underbrush. The resort's lights were all out. The buildings loomed like black monoliths against the stormy sky. As I neared the water, I heard a loud mechanical grinding noise. Squinting through the downpour, I saw an enormous structure rising from the waves, some kind of industrial platform bristling with equipment. This was no resort. It was a facade for something much more sinister. Voices and flashlight beams approached rapidly from behind. I spotted a small motorboat tethered nearby and made a desperate sprint for it. Just as I reached it, rough hands grabbed me. I thrashed wildly, breaking free and tumbling into the boat. By some miracle, the engine started on the first try. I sped off into the choppy waters as shouts and alarms blared behind me. The storm was intensifying, massive swells threatening to capsize my tiny vessel. But I kept going, knowing whatever was on that island was far more dangerous than the sea. After hours of terrifying rain-blind navigation, I spotted the lights of a large ship. Using the last of the boat's fuel, I managed to reach it. It was a cruise liner that had been forced off course by the storm. The crew pulled me aboard, shocked to find someone out in such conditions. I babbled my story to the ship's security team. They were skeptical, but agreed to contact the authorities about the island. But when Coast Guard ships reached the coordinates the next day, they found no traces of any resort or structure, just an uninhabited jungle island. To this day, I don't know what sinister purpose that fake resort served or who was behind it. But I'm certain that if I hadn't escaped that night, I would have disappeared without a trace. Just another tourist who never returned from paradise. I still have nightmares about shadowy figures and artificial waves, and I'll never set foot on a tropical island again. I was so excited for my first African safari. After months of planning and saving, I finally arrived in Kenya with my friends Mike and Lisa. We'd booked a week-long tour through the Masai Mara, one of the most famous wildlife reserves in Africa. The first few days were incredible. We saw lions lounging in the grass, herds of elephants at watering holes, and even a leopard draped over a tree branch. Our guide, Joseph, was incredibly knowledgeable and seemed to have a sixth sense for spotting animals. On the fourth day, we set out early for a long drive deeper into the reserve. Joseph said we might have a chance to see some rarer animals like rhinos or cheetahs. The landscape gradually changed as we drove, becoming more rugged and wild. By mid-afternoon, we were in a remote area I hadn't seen on any of the maps. Suddenly, there was a loud clunking sound from the engine, and the Land Rover shuddered to a stop. Joseph tried to restart it, but nothing happened. He got out to take a look under the hood, muttering to himself in Swahili. After a few minutes of tinkering, he turned to us with a grim expression. "I'm afraid we have a serious problem," he said. "The timing belt has snapped. We won't be able to drive anywhere until it's replaced." A chill ran down my spine as I looked around at the vast, empty savanna stretching in every direction. We were truly in the middle of nowhere. "What do we do now?" Lisa asked, her voice tight with worry. Joseph tried the radio, but we were too far out to get a signal. He explained that he would have to hike to the nearest ranger station for help, but it was at least 15 miles away. "I can make it there and back by morning if I leave now," he said. "You'll be safe in the vehicle overnight. Just keep the windows up and don't get out for any reason." None of us liked the idea of Joseph leaving, but we knew it was the only option. He gave us some emergency supplies and strict instructions before setting off at a brisk pace. We watched until his figure disappeared into the shimmering heat haze. As the sun began to set, an uneasy silence fell over us. The vastness of the African wilderness suddenly felt oppressive. Strange animal calls echoed in the distance. Shadows lengthened across the plain, creating eerie shapes in the fading light. "Let's try to get some sleep," Mike suggested. "The night will pass quicker that way." We reclined our seats and tried to get comfortable, but sleep was impossible. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made me jolt awake. The darkness pressing against the windows seemed alive somehow, full of watching eyes. Around midnight, a blood-curdling roar split the air. It sounded like a lion, but unnaturally loud and close. We huddled together, hearts pounding. More roars and guttural growls followed, seeming to circle our vehicle. I was certain we were about to be attacked by a pride of lions. But then the noises stopped as suddenly as they had started. An eerie quiet descended, broken only by our ragged breathing. I peered out the window, straining to see anything in the inky blackness. That's when I saw them, a pair of glowing eyes, reflecting the faint moonlight. They were too high off the ground to be a lion or any other animal I could think of. The eyes blinked slowly, deliberately. I felt pinned by that gaze, unable to look away or even speak. I don't know how long I stared at those eyes. It could have been minutes or hours. Eventually, I must have dozed off from sheer exhaustion. When I snapped awake again, watery pre-dawn light was filtering through the windows. The eyes were gone, but an overwhelming sense of being watched remained. As the sun rose, we scanned the area around the vehicle. There were no tracks or signs of any large predators. But the grass in a wide circle around us was strangely flattened, as if something massive had been pacing around us all night. Joseph returned with a rescue team mid-morning. As they worked on fixing the engine, I pulled him aside and hesitantly described what I'd seen in the night. A shadow passed over his face. "There are things in the deep wilderness that defy explanation," he said quietly. "Things the Maasai have known about for generations. It's best not to speak of them." He refused to say anything more on the subject. Soon we were on our way back to the lodge, the strange events of the night already starting to feel like a bad dream. But that night changed me. I still love nature and wildlife, but I have a new respect for the untamed places of the world. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I swear I can feel those eyes watching me again. I've never been able to fully explain or understand what happened that night in the African savannah. Was it just fear and imagination playing tricks on me? Or did we encounter something truly unexplainable? I'm not sure I'll ever know for certain, but I do know that I'll never forget those glowing eyes in the darkness, or the primal fear I felt in their gaze. The experience left me with a lingering sense of unease about the natural world. There's so much we don't understand, so many mysteries still hidden in the wild places of the earth. I used to think of nature as something beautiful, but ultimately knowable. Now I realize there are aspects of it that may always remain beyond our comprehension. I've done a lot of research since that night, trying to find any similar accounts or explanations. I've come across vague references to creatures in African folklore that might fit what we encountered, but nothing conclusive. Mike and Lisa don't like to talk about that night. I think they've convinced themselves it was all just a product of fear and exhaustion. Maybe they're right, but I can't shake the feeling that we brushed up against something ancient and unknowable out there in the savannah. I still go camping and hiking, but I'm much more cautious now. I always make sure I have a reliable vehicle and emergency communications, and I never venture too far off the beaten path anymore. Some part of me is always listening for those roars in the night, always watching for those eyes in the darkness. I know this all probably sounds crazy. Most days, I manage to push the memory to the back of my mind and go about my normal life. But every so often, usually when I'm alone at night, it all comes rushing back. The vastness of the savannah, the primal sounds in the darkness, those glowing, intelligent eyes. In those moments, I'm right back in that broken-down Land Rover, heart pounding, certain that something impossible is circling in the night, something that, by all logic, shouldn't exist. In the light of day, it's easy to dismiss as an overactive imagination. But in the dark, I'm never quite sure. I don't know if I'll ever fully come to terms with what happened that night. Part of me wants to go back to Africa to try to find answers, but a bigger part is terrified of what I might discover if I did. For now, I've made my peace with not knowing. Some mysteries I've learned are better left unsolved. I boarded the luxurious cruise ship with high hopes for a relaxing vacation, my worries left behind on the shore. The majestic Voyager lived up to its name: gleaming decks, opulent lounges, gourmet restaurants. I settled into my cozy cabin and headed to the Lido deck to watch as we pulled away from port. The first couple days were blissful. I lounged by the pool, indulged in fancy cocktails, and chatted with fellow passengers. But on the third night, an uneasy feeling crept over me. At dinner, I noticed the couple I'd met the day before was absent. When I asked the waiter about them, he seemed evasive, mumbling something about them feeling under the weather. The next morning, whispers circulated that the couple was missing. Security did a cabin check, but found no trace of them. An announcement assured us they were investigating, but insisted there was no cause for alarm. Still, I noticed crew members exchanging worried glances. That afternoon by the pool, I struck up a conversation with an older woman named Margaret. She confided that she thought she'd seen something strange the night before. A shadowy figure dragging what looked like a body across the deck around 3 a.m. A chill ran down my spine. I tried to convince myself she must have been mistaken. But that evening, another passenger vanished without a trace. a single man in his 40s who'd been sitting alone at the bar each night. The mood on the ship grew tense. People huddled in small groups, eyeing strangers suspiciously. I overheard frantic phone calls to loved ones back home. I tossed and turned that night, my mind racing. Around 2 a.m. I gave up on sleep and decided to get some fresh air. The decks were eerily empty and silent. As I rounded a corner, I froze. A tall figure in dark clothing was bent over something on the ground. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was a body. The figure straightened suddenly and turned. In the dim light, I caught a glimpse of a face twisted into a grotesque smile. My heart pounding, I ran. I sprinted back to my cabin and locked the door, trembling. Sleep was impossible. As soon as the sun rose, I went to the purser's desk and demanded to speak to the captain. After an agonizing wait, I was ushered into his office. I blurted out what I'd seen, my words tumbling out in a panicked rush. The captain's face grew grave. He assured me they would investigate immediately and asked me to return to my cabin for my own safety. Back in my room, I paced anxiously. Hours crawled by with no word. Finally, there was a knock. I opened the door to find 2 security officers. They wanted to review the ship's security footage with me to see if I could identify the person I'd seen. In a small, stuffy room, we pored over grainy video. My hands shook as I fast-forwarded through hours of mundane hallway footage. Suddenly I saw it, the dark figure dragging something heavy. I pointed, my voice barely a whisper. There. The officers leaned in, squinting. One gasped. The figure looked directly at the camera, and even in the poor-quality video, that chilling smile was unmistakable. It was the ship's head of security. Everything happened in a blur after that. Alarms blared. Passengers were ordered to their cabins. I huddled on my bed, heart racing, as shouts and pounding footsteps echoed through the halls. An eternity seemed to pass. Finally, the captain's voice came over the loudspeaker. The head of security had been apprehended. A search of his quarters revealed grisly evidence, personal effects from the missing passengers, along with other things I don't want to describe. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As the announcement continued, my blood ran cold. They hadn't found the security chief alone. He had an accomplice, another crew member who was still at large somewhere on the ship. Panic set in. I couldn't stay here, trapped on this floating nightmare with a killer still on the loose. My only thought was escape. I grabbed my life jacket and crept out of my cabin. The halls were deserted as I made my way to the upper deck where the lifeboats were stored. I'd almost reached them when I heard footsteps. I ducked behind a stack of chairs, hardly daring to breathe. A figure came into view, a man in a crew uniform. He was muttering to himself, agitated. As he passed by, I caught a glimpse of something dark staining his sleeve. My stomach lurched. I waited until he was out of sight, then sprinted to the nearest lifeboat. My hands shook as I fumbled with the release mechanism. Just as I heard shouts in the distance, the boat splashed into the water. I scrambled down the ladder and tumbled in. I rowed frantically, not daring to look back until I was a safe distance away. The ship loomed behind me, lights blazing against the night sky. I shuddered, thinking of the horror I'd left behind. As the adrenaline faded, the reality of my situation sank in. I was alone in a tiny boat on the vast ocean, but as terrifying as that was, it was still better than staying on that ship of horrors. I turned my eyes to the horizon and kept rowing, praying I'd find rescue before my strength gave out. I don't know how long I drifted. Days blurred together in a haze of exhaustion, thirst, and fear. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, I spotted a fishing boat in the distance. I waved and shouted with the last of my energy. They pulled me aboard, shocked at my appearance and wild tale. We made it back to shore, where I was met by police and my frantic family. I learned that a massive search had been launched when the cruise ship reported multiple passengers missing. They eventually caught the second killer trying to slip away at the next port. It's been months, but I still have nightmares about those terrifying nights at sea. I don't know if I'll ever be able to set foot on a ship again. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear waves lapping against the hull and footsteps creeping down the hall. I know I'm safe now, but part of me wonders if I'll ever truly escape that floating nightmare. I was backpacking through Europe, trying to find myself, or whatever cliché 20-somethings are supposed to be doing when they travel alone. Honestly, I was just bored and restless back home, so I figured why not blow my savings on a solo adventure. It had been going pretty well for the first few weeks. I'd seen the major sights, made some friends at hostels, gotten drunk in pubs, the usual backpacker stuff. But I was starting to feel a bit jaded by the whole touristy experience. I wanted something more authentic, off the beaten path. That's how I ended up in this tiny village in rural Romania. It wasn't even on most maps. I'd heard about it from some locals I met on a train, who said it was a hidden gem with real Romanian charm. Should have known better than to trust the recommendations of drunk strangers, I guess. The village was less charming hidden gem and more depressing time capsule. Most of the buildings looked like they hadn't been updated since the fall of communism. There were more stray dogs than people on the streets. The few locals I saw eyed me suspiciously. Great authentic experience so far. I was starting to regret my decision to come here, but it was getting late, and I needed a place to crash for the night. There was only one hostel in town, if you could even call it that. It was this massive, dilapidated old building on the outskirts of the village that looked like it belonged in a horror movie. Paint peeling, boarded-up windows, the works. The faded sign out front proclaimed it as Hostel Dracula. How original. I seriously considered just sleeping at the bus stop instead, but it was freezing out and I was exhausted. So I sucked it up and went inside, figuring it couldn't be that bad. Oh, how wrong I was. The interior was even creepier than the outside. The lobby was dimly lit by flickering fluorescent bulbs that cast weird shadows. Everything was coated in a thick layer of dust. The few pieces of furniture looked like they'd been scavenged from a junkyard. Behind the front desk was this ancient woman who looked like she could have been Dracula's grandmother. When I asked about a room, she just silently handed me a rusty key without making eye contact. Didn't ask for payment or ID or anything. I was starting to get serious serial killer vibes, but I was committed at this point. I hauled my backpack up the creaky stairs, trying to shake off my unease. The hallway was long and narrow, lined with identical peeling doors. Mine was at the very end. Inside wasn't much better than the rest of the place. Lumpy mattress, threadbare blanket, cracked mirror. But at least it locked from the inside. I was so tired I figured I'd just pass out and deal with getting the hell out of there in the morning. But as I was drifting off, I started noticing things. Little sounds that didn't quite make sense. The shuffle of footsteps in the hallway, even though I hadn't seen any other guests. Muffled whispers that seemed to be coming from inside the walls. I told myself it was just an old building settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was jolting awake in pitch darkness. The power had gone out. And in that moment of disorientation, I became acutely aware that I wasn't alone in the room. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel a presence looming over me. The air felt thick and heavy, pressing down on my chest. I was paralyzed with terror, unable to move or scream. All I could do was lie there, heart pounding, as I felt icy fingers brush against my face. Just as I thought I was going to lose my mind, the lights flickered back on. The room was empty. I bolted upright, gasping for air. Had I imagined it? Some kind of sleep paralysis, maybe? But then I saw them, long scratch marks gouged into the wooden floor next to my bed. That was it. I didn't care what time it was. I was getting the fuck out of there. I grabbed my stuff and ran down the stairs, not even bothering to return the key. The old woman was still at the desk, staring blankly ahead like she hadn't moved all night. As I burst out the front door, I nearly collided with a guy in a police uniform. He looked startled to see me and started rapid-firing questions in Romanian. When I just stared at him blankly, he switched to broken English. "What you doing here? Is not safe. Gas leak, very dangerous. All people evacuate yesterday." I felt the blood drain from my face as the implications sank in. If the hostel had been evacuated, then who the hell had checked me in last night? Who were the other guests I'd heard? I stammered out an explanation of how I'd stayed there, gesturing wildly at the building behind me. The officer's eyes widened in disbelief. He pulled out a radio and started talking urgently to someone. Then he turned back to me with a grim expression. "Is not possible. This place, it burned down. Fire 2 years ago. Many people die." I spun around, expecting to see the burned-out shell of a building. But there it was, just like before, old and run down, but very much intact. I blinked hard, wondering if I was hallucinating. When I looked again, everything had changed. The hostel was gone. In its place were the charred remains of a foundation overgrown with weeds. I staggered backwards, my mind reeling. The officer caught me before I could fall, looking concerned. "You okay? Maybe hit head? Come, hospital check you." I let him lead me away, too shocked to protest. As we walked down the road, I glanced back one last time. For a split second, I swear I saw the old woman standing in the empty lot, smiling at me with rows of sharp teeth. Then she vanished like smoke. I spent the next few days in the hospital, alternating between trying to convince myself it had all been some kind of stress-induced hallucination and obsessively researching the history of the hostel. I found old newspaper articles about the fire. Apparently, it had been a scandal because the place was violating all kinds of safety codes. There were even rumors that the owners had intentionally started the fire for insurance money. The rational part of my brain tells me there has to be some logical explanation. Maybe someone drugged me, or I wandered into an abandoned building in a fugue state. But deep down, I know what I experienced was real. Those entities or spirits or whatever they were toying with me, feeding off my fear. I cut my trip short and flew home after that. I still travel sometimes, but never alone, and I always thoroughly research any place I stay. But no matter where I go, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that something followed me home from that cursed hostel. Sometimes at night, I still hear those whispers, and in my dreams, I see the old woman's sharp-toothed smile. I was so excited for our road trip through the Australian outback. My 3 best mates and I had been planning it for months, the ultimate adventure before we all went our separate ways after uni. We'd saved up, rented a sturdy 4x4, and mapped out an epic route through the Red Centre. The first few days were absolutely brilliant. We camped under the stars, marveled at Uluru, and felt like we were on top of the world. Looking back now, I wish we'd just turned around and headed home after that. But we were young and invincible, eager to push further into the remote wilderness. On day 4, we decided to take a shortcut down an isolated dirt track. Big mistake. About 100 kilometers in, our engine started making an awful clanking sound. Thick black smoke poured out from under the hood. We barely managed to pull over before the car died completely. At first, we tried to stay calm. We had extra water and some food. Surely someone would drive by eventually, right? But as the hours ticked by under the blistering sun, a gnawing sense of dread set in. We were utterly alone in this vast, barren landscape. Night fell, bringing an eerie stillness. The temperature plummeted. We huddled in the car, too on edge to sleep. That's when we first noticed the lights in the distance. Faint at first, then growing brighter. Our spirits lifted, maybe a passing truck. But as the lights drew closer, something felt off. It was a battered old ute, packed with what looked like hunting gear. 4 men got out, rough-looking blokes with wild beards and leathery skin. I felt a chill run down my spine as they approached, despite the friendly smiles plastered on their faces. "G'day, fellas. Looks like you're in a spot of trouble," the oldest one called out. "Need a hand?" We explained our situation, trying to mask our unease. They nodded sympathetically, but I couldn't shake the feeling that their eyes were a little too eager, their smiles a little too wide. "Tell you what," the leader said, "we've got some tools back at our place. Why don't we tow you there and see if we can't get you sorted?" Every instinct screamed that this was a bad idea. But what choice did we have? We were desperate, and they seemed to be our only lifeline. So we agreed, and they hitched our car to theirs. As we bounced along the rough track, my mate Tom leaned in close and whispered, "I've got a really bad feeling about this, mate." I nodded grimly. The whole situation felt wrong. After about an hour, we pulled up to a ramshackle collection of buildings that looked like something out of a horror film. Rusted machinery and animal bones littered the yard. The air reeked of decay. "Home, sweet home," our rescuer announced cheerfully. "Let's get you boys inside and we'll take a look at that car in the morning." We hesitated, but they were already unloading our bags. With forced smiles, we followed them into the main house. The interior was dimly lit and cluttered. Faded newspaper clippings covered one wall. I caught glimpses of missing person reports before our host ushered us quickly past. They sat us down at a grimy table and broke out some beers. As they chatted and joked, I couldn't help but notice how their eyes kept darting to our bags, to the windows, to each other. There was an undercurrent of tension, like predators circling their prey. I made an excuse about needing the toilet and slipped away. Heart pounding, I crept down a dark hallway, straining my ears for any sound of pursuit. A door stood ajar at the end. I peered inside and had to clamp a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. The room was full of personal belongings, wallets, phones, cameras, things that looked like they belonged to dozens of different people, travelers, like us. I hurried back to my friends, trying to keep my face neutral. "We need to leave. Now," I hissed urgently. Tom's eyes widened in understanding. He nodded almost imperceptibly and whispered to the others. We made a show of yawning and stretching. "Think we'll turn in for the night, if that's all right," I said casually. "Long day on the road and all that." Our hosts exchanged glances. Course," the leader said smoothly. "Guest room's just down the hall. Sleep tight, boys." We grabbed our bags and hustled to the room, locking the door behind us. "What did you see?" Jake demanded. I told them everything in a rushed whisper. "They're not here to help us," I concluded. "We need to get out of here before they decide to make their move." We formulated a hasty plan. The window was small, but we thought we could squeeze through. We'd make a run for our car and pray it would start. Just as we were about to put our plan into action, heavy footsteps approached our door. A fist pounded on the wood. "Everything all right in there, boys?" came a gruff voice. "Thought I heard some commotion." "All good," I called back, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "Just settling in." There was a long pause. Then, "Right then, good night." We waited, hardly daring to breathe, until the footsteps receded. Then we sprang into action. Jake managed to work the window open, and we scrambled out one by one, our hearts racing. We'd barely made it halfway across the yard when a shout rang out behind us. "Oi! Where do you think you're going?" We ran. I've never run so hard in my life. I could hear them crashing after us, their angry yells piercing the night. We reached our car and piled in, fumbling with the keys. Come on," Tom muttered desperately as he turned the ignition. The engine sputtered and died. Our pursuers were getting closer. "Try again," I yelled. Tom cranked the key once more. This time, miraculously, the engine roared to life. We peeled out of there in a spray of dust and gravel, our tormentors left cursing in our wake. We drove for hours, too terrified to stop. The sun was peeking over the horizon when we finally reached a small town. We went straight to the police station and reported everything. The cops seemed skeptical at first, but eventually sent out a patrol to investigate. They later told us they found the place abandoned, with evidence that the occupants had cleared out in a hurry. To this day, I don't know exactly what those men had planned for us, but I'm certain that if we hadn't escaped when we did, we would have become another set of missing person reports tacked to that wall. I still have nightmares about that night sometimes. The vast emptiness of the outback, the leering grins of our rescuers, the stomach-dropping realization of the danger we were in. It's a stark reminder of how quickly an adventure can turn into a nightmare, and how thin the line is between civilization and savagery in the most remote corners of the world. I'm grateful every day that we made it out alive, but a part of me will always be haunted by the what-ifs. What if our car hadn't started? What if we'd fallen asleep in that house? What happened to all those other travelers whose belongings we saw? The Australian outback is a place of incredible beauty, but it's also a place where the unwary can vanish without a trace. Take it from someone who came far too close to that fate. Some shortcuts aren't worth taking, and some helping hands are better left unclasped. I was in desperate need of a break from the daily grind, so I decided to treat myself to a relaxing beach getaway. After browsing online for hours, I found what seemed like the perfect rental, a quaint beachfront cottage with stunning ocean views. The price was surprisingly affordable for such a prime location, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I was just excited to have scored such a great deal. As soon as I arrived and stepped out of my car, I felt an odd sense of unease wash over me. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to travel fatigue. The exterior of the cottage was charming enough, with weathered blue siding and white trim, but something about it just felt off. I grabbed my bags and made my way to the front door, fumbling with the lockbox to retrieve the key. As I entered, a musty, almost metallic smell hit my nostrils. I wrinkled my nose and made a mental note to air the place out. The interior was sparsely furnished but tidy enough. Faded floral curtains framed the windows, and worn area rugs dotted the hardwood floors. I started unpacking and settling in, trying to ignore the growing feeling of discomfort in the pit of my stomach. As I hung up some clothes in the bedroom closet, I noticed something odd on the inside of the door. At first glance, it looked like random scratches or gouges in the wood, but upon closer inspection, I realized they formed intricate symbols and patterns. They didn't look like any language I recognized, just abstract swirls and jagged lines etched deeply into the wood. A chill ran down my spine as I traced my fingers over the strange markings. Who had carved these, and why? I tried to rationalize that it was probably just bored teenagers or previous renters messing around, but a nagging voice in the back of my mind whispered that there was something more sinister at play. I finished unpacking and decided to head down to the beach to clear my head. The sun was starting to set, casting a golden glow across the sand and waves. I breathed in the salty air, hoping it would chase away the unsettling vibes from the cottage. For a little while, it seemed to work. I strolled along the shoreline, collecting seashells and letting the surf lap at my feet. But as dusk settled in and the beach grew dark, that creeping sense of unease returned. I hurried back to the cottage, my peaceful mood evaporating with each step. When I reached the front porch, I froze. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw a shadowy figure dart past one of the windows inside. My heart started racing. I told myself it was just my eyes playing tricks on me in the dim light. With trembling hands, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Everything looked normal, but the air felt thick and oppressive. I flipped on all the lights and did a quick search of each room, finding nothing out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to distract myself by making dinner and watching some TV, but I couldn't focus on anything. Every little creak and groan of the old house made me jump. As the night wore on, my nerves grew increasingly frayed. I tossed and turned in bed for hours, unable to fall asleep. Around 3 a.m., I bolted upright, my heart pounding. I could have sworn I heard whispering coming from somewhere in the house. I strained my ears, barely breathing as I listened intently. There it was again, faint, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to be coming from inside the walls themselves. Panic gripped me as I fumbled for my phone on the nightstand. With shaking fingers, I dialed 911. I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation to the dispatcher. They said they would send officers to check things out. I paced anxiously as I waited for the police to arrive, jumping at every little sound. After what felt like an eternity, I heard a knock at the door. 2 officers stood on the porch, looking slightly skeptical but professional. I recounted everything that had happened, the strange symbols, the whispering, the overall feeling of dread that permeated the house. They nodded and took notes, then asked to take a look around. I followed them as they methodically searched each room. At first, they didn't find anything out of the ordinary, but when we got to the bathroom, one of the officers let out a startled exclamation. He was crouched down, examining the base of the toilet. When he stood up, his gloved hand was smeared with what looked horribly like fresh blood. My legs nearly gave out from under me. The officers immediately went into high alert, calling for backup and instructing me to wait outside. In a daze, I stumbled out onto the porch and sank down onto the steps. The next few hours passed in a blur. More police cars and even some crime scene technicians arrived. They combed every inch of the property, taking samples and photographs. I answered their questions as best I could, but I was still in shock. As the sun began to rise, one of the original officers approached me with a grim expression. They hadn't found any signs of forced entry or evidence of anyone else in the house besides me. The blood appeared to be human, but they would need to run tests to be sure. And strangest of all, by the time the crime scene techs had arrived to process the bathroom, the blood had completely vanished without a trace. I felt like I was losing my mind. How was any of this possible? The officer advised me to find somewhere else to stay while they continued their investigation. I didn't need to be told twice. I threw my belongings haphazardly into my suitcase and got the hell out of there as fast as I could. In the days and weeks that followed, I obsessively researched the history of that cottage and the surrounding area, desperate for answers. I discovered that the land it was built on had once belonged to a Native American tribe who believed it to be a place where the veil between worlds was thin. There were also unconfirmed rumors of occult activity in the area dating back decades. But in the end, I was left with more questions than answers. The police investigation turned up nothing conclusive. The rental company claimed to have no knowledge of any unusual activity at the property, and to this day, I have no rational explanation for what I experienced in that seaside cottage. All I know is that I'll never forget the oppressive darkness that seemed to seep from the very walls, the disembodied whispers that chilled me to my core, and the undeniable sense that something ancient and malevolent had taken notice of me during my stay. I still have nightmares about that place. In my darkest moments, I wonder if perhaps I brought something back with me, some lingering trace of that evil presence, because even now, years later, I sometimes wake in the night to the faint sound of whispering coming from just beyond the edge of hearing, and for a terrifying instant, I'm right back in that cottage by the sea, with unseen eyes watching me from the shadows. The day started like any other. I woke up early in a small guest house in Luang Namtha, eager to set off on a solo trek into the nearby Nam Ha National Protected Area. The owner warned me to stick to the main trails, but I foolishly brushed off his concerns. I was an experienced hiker after all. What could go wrong? As I ventured deeper into the dense jungle, the oppressive heat and humidity clung to my skin. Sweat poured down my face as I hacked through vines and pushed past broad-leafed plants. The cacophony of birds and insects was almost deafening. After a few hours, I realized I had completely lost the trail. Panic started to set in as I tried to retrace my steps, but every direction looked the same, just an endless sea of green. That's when I heard voices in the distance. Relief washed over me. Other hikers. I could ask for directions back to town. I eagerly pushed through the foliage towards the sound. But as I got closer, I realized they weren't speaking English or any language I recognized. I crouched down and peered through a gap in the leaves. What I saw made my blood run cold. About 50 meters away was a clearing with several rough wooden structures. Men with guns slung over their shoulders were loading large burlap sacks onto trucks. Even from a distance, I could smell the sickly, sweet odor of opium. My breath caught in my throat as the realization hit me. I had stumbled upon a drug operation deep in the jungle. I started to slowly back away, praying they hadn't noticed me. But in my haste, I stepped on a branch. The sharp crack echoed through the trees. Everything went silent for a moment. Then shouting erupted from the camp. Oh God, they had heard me. Adrenaline surged through my body as I turned and ran blindly into the jungle. I could hear men crashing through the undergrowth behind me, their angry voices getting closer. Branches whipped at my face and I tripped over roots, but sheer terror kept me on my feet. My lungs burned as I gasped for air in the thick, humid atmosphere. I dared a glance over my shoulder and saw a glint of metal through the trees. One of the men had raised his gun. The crack of a gunshot sent birds scattering from the canopy. I ducked instinctively, feeling the bullet whiz past my ear. They were shooting at me. This was really happening. My mind raced as I sprinted through the foliage. How had a simple hike turned into a life-or-death situation? I was just a tourist. I didn't want any trouble. But I knew these men wouldn't care. They would kill me without hesitation to protect their operation. I could hear a river up ahead and pushed myself to run faster. If I could just make it to the water, maybe I could lose them. I burst out of the tree line onto a rocky riverbank. The murky brown water rushed past, filled with debris from recent rains. I hesitated for a split second. The current looked treacherous, but I could hear my pursuers closing in. It was my only chance. I dove into the churning water. The shock of the cold knocked the breath out of me. I was immediately swept downstream, bouncing off rocks and struggling to keep my head above water. I heard more gunshots and shouting from the bank, but the roar of the rapids drowned everything out. The river tossed me like a rag doll. I gasped for air whenever I breached the surface, choking on mouthfuls of muddy water. My body slammed into boulders, leaving bruises and cuts all over. But I didn't dare try to swim to shore. I had to put as much distance as possible between me and those men. I don't know how long I was in that river. It felt like hours. Eventually the current slowed, and I was able to drag myself onto a sandy bank. I collapsed on the ground, coughing up water and gasping for breath. Every inch of my body ached, but I was alive. As the adrenaline faded, the reality of my situation sunk in. I was lost in the middle of the Laotian jungle, soaking wet, with no supplies or way to contact anyone. And there were armed men potentially still looking for me. I wanted to break down and cry, but I knew I had to keep moving. I oriented myself using the sun and started walking, hoping to find a village or road. Hours passed as I stumbled through the oppressive jungle. The constant drone of insects and squawks of birds set me on edge. Every snapping twig made me jump, convinced the drug traffickers were right behind me. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, I heard the distant rumble of engines. A wave of relief washed over me as I emerged from the tree line onto a dirt road. An old pickup truck was approaching. I waved my arms frantically, praying they would stop. The truck screeched to a halt, and an elderly Laotian couple peered out at me in concern. I must have been quite a sight, soaking wet, covered in cuts and bruises, wild-eyed with fear. I babbled in broken Lao, begging for help. They quickly ushered me into the truck bed and sped off towards the nearest town. I spent the next few days recovering in a small clinic, being treated for dehydration and my various injuries. I told the local authorities a vague story about getting lost while hiking and nearly drowning in the river. I was too afraid to mention what I had really seen. What if the cartel had connections in the police force? As soon as I was well enough to travel, I fled the country. I didn't feel safe until I was on a plane heading far away from Laos. To this day, I'm haunted by how close I came to death in those jungles. The terror of being hunted by those men still gives me nightmares. I used to seek out adventure and danger in my travels, but that experience changed me forever. I realized how quickly an exciting trip can turn deadly in unfamiliar territory. Now I stick to well-traveled routes and tour groups. Some might call me boring, but I'm just grateful to be alive. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. It seems too horrific to be real. But then I catch a glimpse of the scars on my body from that harrowing escape down the river, and I know it wasn't a dream. I faced true evil that day in the jungles of Laos, and I'll carry that trauma with me for the rest of my life. I often think about those men in the jungle. Are they still out there, running their drug operation with impunity? How many other unsuspecting hikers have stumbled upon their camp? Did they all manage to escape like I did? The thought makes me shudder. There are dark corners of this world that tourists are never meant to see. I got a glimpse behind that curtain, and it nearly cost me everything. So let my story be a warning to other adventure seekers out there. Respect local advice, stick to marked trails, and always let someone know where you're going. The thrill of exploration isn't worth your life. I still travel, but with a much greater sense of caution now. I appreciate the beauty of nature from a safe distance, and I never ever venture off into unknown jungles alone. Some lessons you only need to learn once. I just feel lucky I survived long enough to learn mine. It all started when I joined a small team of researchers and explorers planning to venture deep into a remote area of the Brazilian Amazon rainforest. Our goal was to document rare flora and fauna and potentially make contact with isolated indigenous tribes. We had all the proper permits and approvals, but nothing could have prepared us for what we encountered out there. After flying into Manaus, we took a small chartered plane to a tiny outpost at the edge of the jungle. From there, we loaded up our gear and supplies into canoes and set off down the river. For the first few days, everything went smoothly. We marveled at the lush greenery surrounding us, the colorful birds flying overhead, and the occasional glimpse of monkeys swinging through the trees. On the fourth day, we left the river behind and began trekking on foot through dense rainforest. The humidity was oppressive, and we were constantly swatting away mosquitoes and other biting insects. But spirits remained high as we collected plant and insect samples and set up motion-activated cameras to try and capture footage of elusive animals. It was on the sixth day that things took a dark turn. We had just finished setting up camp for the night when our guide, João, suddenly froze and held up his hand for silence. At first, I didn't hear anything unusual, just the typical buzzing of insects and occasional bird calls. But then I noticed an eerie quiet settling over the forest. The usual animal sounds had stopped. João whispered for us to quickly and quietly pack up our gear. His face was tense, and I could see real fear in his eyes. As we scrambled to break down the tents, I heard it, the faint sound of drumming in the distance. A chill ran down my spine. We set off at a brisk pace, trying to put distance between us and the drums without making too much noise. João explained in hushed tones that those drums likely signaled the presence of an uncontacted tribe, and that we needed to leave their territory immediately. He said some of these isolated groups could be extremely hostile to outsiders. As we hurried through the darkening forest, the drumming grew louder. My heart was pounding, and I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see painted warriors emerging from the shadows. Suddenly, João stopped short and pointed to something on the ground. It was a footprint, much larger than any of ours, and it was fresh. Panic started to set in as we realized we were being stalked. We abandoned any pretense of stealth and started running. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush. I could hear heavy breathing and the snapping of twigs behind us, but I didn't dare look back. We ran for what felt like hours, stumbling through the pitch-black forest. The sounds of pursuit never let up. Occasionally, we'd hear shouts or what sounded like bird calls, but we knew they were signals being used to track us. Just when I thought my legs would give out, we burst into a small clearing lit by the full moon. In the center was an enormous gnarled tree unlike any I'd ever seen. João gasped and said it was a samaúma, a sacred tree revered by many Amazonian tribes. We had only moments to catch our breath before dark shapes emerged from the tree line on the other side of the clearing. In the moonlight, I could make out about a dozen warriors, their bodies adorned with paint and feathers. They carried spears and blowguns, all pointed directly at us. My blood ran cold as I realized we were completely surrounded and outnumbered. This was it. We were going to die here in this clearing. at the hands of an uncontacted tribe who saw us as invaders. I closed my eyes and waited for the attack, but it never came. When I opened my eyes again, the warriors were gone. It was as if they had melted back into the forest. We stood frozen for several minutes, unsure if this was some kind of trick, but the forest remained silent. Juon was the first to move. He approached the massive samauma tree and placed his hand on its trunk, murmuring what sounded like a prayer. He then turned to us and said we needed to leave an offering before departing. We each placed a small personal item at the base of the tree: a watch, a pocket knife, a compass. As we turned to leave the clearing, I glanced back one last time. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw faces peering out from knots in the tree trunk, but when I blinked, they were gone. We spent the next 2 days in a desperate trek back towards the river, barely stopping to rest. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves made us jump, but we encountered no further signs of the tribe that had stalked us. Finally, we reached the river and our canoes. As we paddled frantically downstream, the reality of what we'd experienced began to sink in. We had unknowingly trespassed on sacred land and nearly paid for it with our lives. The tribe could have easily killed us at any point, but for some reason had chosen to let us go after we made an offering to their holy tree. Even now, safe at home, I'm haunted by that night in the clearing. The image of those silent warriors emerging from the darkness is seared into my mind. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear distant drumming. I've tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was all a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear. But deep down, I know what we experienced was real. There are things in this world that defy explanation, ancient powers that we can't begin to comprehend. I set out on that expedition seeking adventure and discovery. Instead, I found terror and a humbling reminder of how little we truly understand about this planet and its mysteries. I'll never look at the natural world the same way again, and I'll certainly never set foot in the Amazon rainforest again as long as I live. To anyone planning their own expedition to remote areas, be careful. Show respect for the land and its people, and be prepared for the possibility that some places simply don't want to be explored. There are secrets in this world that are meant to stay hidden. There were 5 of us, me, Jake, Emma, Chris, and Megan. We'd all been friends since college and tried to take a trip together each year. This time we decided on a 3-day backpacking adventure in Redwood National Park. The first day was amazing. We hiked deep into the forest, craning our necks to take in the towering redwoods all around us. The trees were so huge, it felt like we'd stepped back in time to some prehistoric era. As the sun started to set, we found a nice clearing to set up camp for the night. We built a fire, roasted hot dogs and marshmallows, and stayed up late swapping stories and laughing. It wasn't until the next morning that things started to get weird. We woke up early, planning to cover a lot of ground that day. But as we hiked, I started to get an uneasy feeling. The forest seemed different somehow, darker, more oppressive. The cheerful bird songs from yesterday were gone, replaced by an eerie silence. "Does anyone else feel like we're being watched?" Emma asked nervously. I was relieved I wasn't the only one who felt it. We all agreed there was a strange vibe, but tried to shrug it off and keep going. A few hours later, we came across something that made my blood run cold. Hidden among the massive redwood trunks was some kind of compound, a cluster of rustic wooden buildings surrounded by a high fence. "What the hell?" Jake muttered. "There's not supposed to be any structures out here. This is protected land." We debated what to do. Part of me wanted to turn back, but curiosity got the better of us. We decided to get a closer look. As we approached, I noticed bizarre symbols carved into the trees and fence posts. They looked ancient, like some kind of runic language. A chill ran down my spine. Suddenly, dark-robed figures emerged from the buildings. Before we could react, they surrounded us. I tried to run, but someone grabbed me from behind. I heard my friends shouting and struggling. Then everything went black. I woke up in a dimly lit room, my head pounding. I was tied to a chair, my friends bound nearby. Panic set in as I realized we'd been captured by some kind of cult. Over the next 24 hours, we were subjected to the most horrifying ordeal imaginable. The cultists, led by a wild-eyed man they called the Oracle, forced us to participate in disturbing rituals. They chanted in a strange language, painted symbols on our skin with what looked like blood, and made us drink some kind of foul-tasting brew that left me dizzy and disoriented. The Oracle kept ranting about cosmic forces and an incoming apocalypse. He said we were going to be vessels for ancient forest spirits. I've never been so terrified in my life. I truly thought we were going to die there. Just when I had lost all hope, we heard shouting and commotion outside. Gunshots rang out. The cultists scattered in panic. Suddenly, police officers burst into the room. In the chaos, we managed to break free of our bonds. The next few hours were a blur. The police rounded up as many cultists as they could, though many escaped into the forest. We were taken to a nearby hospital to get checked out. Physically, we were okay, aside from some cuts and bruises. But mentally, I don't think any of us will ever be the same. The authorities tried to question us about what happened, but we were all still in shock. They told us they'd gotten an anonymous tip about suspicious activity in the area. If that call hadn't come in when it did, I don't want to think about what might have happened to us. It's been 6 months since that nightmare in the redwoods. I still have trouble sleeping. Loud noises make me jump. I can't stand the sight of anything resembling those cultist robes. My friends and I have been going to therapy, trying to process the trauma. But there are so many unanswered questions. Who were those people? What were they really trying to do to us? How long had they been operating out there undetected? The police investigation is ongoing, but they haven't found many answers. Most of the cultists seem to have vanished without a trace. Sometimes I wonder if it was all just a hallucination brought on by that drink they gave us. But then I look at the scars on my wrists from the ropes, or I catch a glimpse of one of those strange symbols they painted on us, not yet fully faded from my skin, and I know it was real. I used to love nature and the peaceful solitude of the forest. Now the thought of being surrounded by trees fills me with dread. I don't know if I'll ever be able to go camping again. Those majestic redwoods that once filled me with awe now only remind me of the terror we endured. I'm sharing this story as a warning. Be careful out there in the wilderness. You never know what secrets those ancient forests might be hiding. Our relaxing getaway turned into a waking nightmare in the blink of an eye. I'm grateful we made it out alive, but the experience will haunt me forever. Those 3 days in the redwoods changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I only hope that somehow sharing this will help me start to heal. I was part of a 6-person expedition team attempting to summit Mount Everest. We'd been planning this climb for over 2 years, training rigorously, studying the route, and preparing for every contingency we could think of, or so we thought. The first few days of the ascent went smoothly. We made good time as we trekked through the Khumbu icefall, carefully navigating the towering ice seracs and deep crevasses. The weather was clear and crisp, perfect climbing conditions. There was an electric buzz of excitement among our team as we established our camps and acclimatized to the altitude. On day 5, we reached Camp 3 at 23,500 feet. The plan was to rest there for a day before pushing on to Camp 4, our final stop before attempting the summit. That evening, our lead guide, Dave, radioed for an updated weather report. His face grew grim as he listened to the crackling transmission. "Major storm system moving in fast," he informed us. "High winds, heavy snow. We need to descend immediately." We quickly packed up our gear and began making our way down the mountain as darkness fell. The wind picked up rapidly, howling and buffeting us as we carefully traversed the narrow paths. Visibility dropped to near zero in the whiteout conditions. We roped ourselves together and inched forward slowly, calling out to each other over the roar of the wind. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet began to tremble and shift. An ear-splitting crack rang out, followed by a low rumbling that quickly grew to a deafening roar. "Avalanche!" someone screamed. Before I could even process what was happening, I was swept off my feet by a massive wave of snow and ice. I tumbled head over heels, completely disoriented as I was tossed about like a rag doll. The sheer force of the avalanche tore me away from my teammates. I desperately tried to swim to the surface, fighting against the crushing weight of the snow. My lungs screamed for air. Just when I thought I couldn't hold my breath any longer, the avalanche's momentum began to slow. As it ground to a halt, I found myself buried under several feet of densely packed snow. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped. I couldn't move, couldn't see, could barely breathe. With my last bit of strength, I managed to create a small air pocket around my face by cupping my hands over my mouth. As the adrenaline faded, the biting cold began to set in. I was soaked to the bone, my clothing offering little protection against the frigid snow pressing in on all sides. I tried to calm my racing thoughts and conserve oxygen, but it was hard to fight the rising tide of fear and despair. I'm not sure how long I was buried. It felt like hours, but was probably only 15 to 20 minutes. Just as I was starting to lose consciousness, I heard muffled voices and the sound of digging. A few moments later, a shaft of light broke through as my teammates uncovered my face. They quickly dug me out, and I gulped in the thin, icy air. As the relief of being rescued washed over me, the grim reality of our situation set in. The avalanche had completely altered the landscape around us. Familiar landmarks were buried or swept away, and 2 members of our team were still missing. We searched for hours in the aftermath of the avalanche, probing the snow and calling out for our lost companions. But as night fell and temperatures plummeted further, we were forced to seek shelter. We managed to dig out a rudimentary snow cave and huddled together for warmth. The storm raged on for days, trapping us in place. We rationed our meager remaining supplies, melting snow for water and eating tiny portions of freeze-dried food. The battery on our satellite phone died, cutting us off from the outside world. As the days wore on with no sign of rescue, despair began to set in. We took turns venturing out to search for our missing teammates and scout for a way down. But the weather and treacherous conditions made it nearly impossible to get our bearings. Several times we thought we'd found a viable route, only to encounter sheer drops or impassable crevasses. On day 6, Eric developed a hacking cough that got progressively worse. By day 8, he was burning with fever and struggling to breathe, the telltale signs of high-altitude pulmonary edema. We knew we had to get him to lower elevation soon, or he wouldn't survive. With Eric's condition deteriorating rapidly, we made the agonizing decision to attempt a descent, even though it meant abandoning the search for our missing teammates. We fashioned a makeshift sled for Eric out of tent poles and fabric and began slowly making our way down the mountain. The going was painfully slow. The storm had dumped several feet of fresh snow, obscuring the route and creating treacherous conditions. We had to constantly backtrack to avoid dead ends and dangerous terrain. Every few hundred feet, we'd have to stop to catch our breath in the thin air. On our third day of descent, disaster struck again. As we traversed a steep slope, the snow gave way beneath us. I watched in horror as Dave, our lead guide, lost his footing and tumbled over the edge of a cliff. There was a sickening moment of silence before we heard the impact far below. Stunned by the sudden loss and utterly exhausted, we barely had the strength to keep going. But we knew stopping meant certain death, so we pressed on, one agonizing step at a time. By some miracle, we eventually made it below the storm. As we emerged from the clouds, we spotted a small Sherpa village in the valley below. With renewed energy, we quickened our pace. We stumbled into the village more dead than alive, collapsing from exhaustion. The villagers took us in, feeding us hot soup and wrapping us in blankets. They radioed for emergency evacuation, and a few hours later, we heard the blessed sound of helicopter blades. As the rescue chopper lifted us off the mountain, I was overwhelmed by a mix of relief, grief, and guilt. We'd lost half our team. The excitement and ambition that drove us up the mountain seemed hollow now, dwarfed by the awesome and indifferent power of nature. It's been 2 years since that ill-fated expedition, but I still have nightmares about being buried alive in that avalanche. The sound of wind howling outside my window can send me into a panic attack. I don't know if I'll ever fully come to terms with what happened on that mountain, but I do know that I'll never take a single breath for granted again. It started with little things. Overheard whispers that would abruptly stop when I walked into the local diner. Sideways glances from shopkeepers who'd been perfectly friendly the day before. The way certain topics seemed off limits, like there was some unspoken rule about what could and couldn't be discussed. I tried to brush it off as small-town quirks, but then people started disappearing. Not in any dramatic way. They'd just vanish. One day they'd be there, and the next, gone without a trace. When I asked around, I got vague answers about people moving away for work or to be closer to family. But something didn't add up. The first disappearance that really caught my attention was old Mr. Jenkins from the hardware store. He'd lived in Millbrook his entire life, knew everyone in town. Then one day, his shop was closed, a for sale sign in the window. When I asked his next-door neighbor what happened, she got this strange, glassy-eyed look and said, "Oh, he decided to retire, move to Florida." But Mr. Jenkins had told me just the week before how much he loved running that store, how he'd never leave Millbrook. I started paying closer attention after that, keeping a mental tally of the people who seemed to vanish into thin air. It wasn't just lifelong residents either. Newcomers like me would sometimes disappear, too. A young couple who'd moved in down the street was there one day, gone the next. Their house sat empty for weeks before a new family suddenly appeared, acting like they'd lived there for years. My curiosity got the better of me, and I started digging. At first, it was just casual questions here and there, but as the answers got more evasive, I knew I was on to something. I started keeping a journal, jotting down names, dates, any strange occurrences I noticed. One night, I was working late at my home office when I heard a noise outside. Peering through the blinds, I saw a black van parked across the street, its windows tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. 2 men in dark suits stood on the sidewalk, talking in low voices. As I watched, they approached my neighbor's house. The Thompsons, a friendly elderly couple who'd always wave when I passed by. The men knocked, and Mr. Thompson answered. There was a brief, hushed conversation, and then the Thompsons left with them. Just like that, at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday night, they packed a small bag and got into the van. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. I knew deep in my gut that I'd just witnessed something I wasn't supposed to see. The next morning, the Thompsons' house was empty, a for sale sign already in the yard. That was when I knew I had to go deeper. I started spending my evenings at the local library, poring over old newspapers and town records. I created a timeline, mapping out when people had arrived in town and when they'd disappeared. Patterns started to emerge. It seemed like every few months, a wave of disappearances would occur, followed by an influx of new residents. But it was what I found in the oldest records that really chilled me to the bone. Millbrook hadn't always been called Millbrook. It had been founded under a different name, one that had been carefully scrubbed from all but the oldest documents. And that original name? It translated roughly to the chosen place. As I dug deeper, I uncovered references to an organization that seemed to be pulling the strings behind the scenes. They were never named directly, always referred to in vague terms like the benefactors or our friends. But their influence was clear. They'd been involved in every major decision in the town's history, from its founding to present day. I was so caught up in my research that I didn't notice how late it had gotten. The library had closed hours ago, but the elderly librarian, Mrs. Patel, had let me stay. As I gathered my notes, ready to head home, I heard voices coming from the back room. Curiosity got the better of me, and I crept closer to listen. "Another cycle is complete," a man's voice said. "The unworthy have been removed, and new potential has been brought in." "And what of the outsider?" This was Mrs. Patel's voice, but it sounded different, colder, more authoritative. The one asking questions? My blood ran cold. They were talking about me. "We're monitoring the situation," the man replied. "If necessary, we'll include them in the next extraction." I didn't wait to hear more. As quietly as I could, I slipped out of the library and ran home, my mind racing. Extraction. That's what they called it when they made people disappear. I spent the next few days in a paranoid haze, jumping at every sound, convinced that Black Van would show up outside my house at any moment. But as the days passed and nothing happened, I realized something. They didn't know how much I knew. I still had time. I threw myself into my investigation with renewed vigor. I started following people, snapping covert photos, recording conversations when I could. I created a massive corkboard in my spare room, connecting threads between people and events, trying to make sense of it all. And slowly, horrifyingly, the picture began to come into focus. Millbrook wasn't just a town, it was an experiment. Some shadowy organization was using it as a testing ground, cycling people in and out, observing their behavior, their interactions. But for what purpose? What were they looking for? I got my answer on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I'd followed one of the town council members to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Hidden behind some crates, I watched as a group gathered, all the major players in town, from the mayor to the high school principal, and at the head of the table, a figure I'd never seen before, a tall, thin man in an impeccable suit. "Our work here continues to yield promising results," the man said, his voice smooth and cultured. "The latest extractions have allowed us to refine our selection process. We're closer than ever to identifying the key traits that make a perfect citizen." Perfect citizen. My mind was reeling. What did that even mean? "And once we've perfected the process," he continued, "we can begin implementing it on a larger scale. Imagine it, Entire cities, states, perhaps even countries, populated only by those who meet our criteria. A world without dissent, without chaos, pure order. I felt sick. This wasn't just some small-town conspiracy. This was something that could change the face of humanity itself. And Millbrook was just the beginning. I knew I had to get this information out to warn people. But as I turned to leave, my foot knocked against a metal pipe. The sound echoed through the warehouse. Every head turned in my direction. "It seems we have an uninvited guest," the thin man said, his voice eerily calm. "Bring them to me." I ran. Out of the warehouse, through the rain-slicked streets, my lungs burning, my heart pounding. I could hear footsteps behind me, getting closer. I ducked down alleys, cut through backyards, desperate to lose my pursuers. Finally, I made it home, slamming the door behind me and locking it. I ran to my spare room, grabbing my research, my photos, everything I'd gathered. I had to get it out, had to tell someone. But as I turned on my computer, ready to upload everything to the internet, the screen went black. Then words appeared. "We know what you've discovered. We're coming for you. But first, we want you to understand." The screen flickered, and suddenly I was looking at images, videos, data, more information than I could process. It was the full scope of their experiment, laid bare. The people they'd extracted weren't gone. They were in other towns, other experiments. Millbrook was just one of dozens, maybe hundreds of similar setups around the world. And as I watched, I began to understand their twisted logic. They genuinely believed they were working towards a better world, a world without conflict, without divergent thoughts or behaviors, a world of perfect uniformity. I don't know how long I sat there, absorbing it all, but eventually I heard a knock at the door. I knew who it was. I'm writing this now as a record, a warning to anyone who might find it. By the time you read this, I'll probably be gone, extracted, placed into another of their experiments. I don't know if I'll remember any of this. I don't know if I'll still be me. But if you're reading this, know that the world isn't what you think it is. Look closer, ask questions, and whatever you do, don't trust the perfect facade, because behind every picturesque small town, every too-good-to-be-true community, there might be something like Millbrook, and once you're in, there's no way out. The knocking is getting louder. They're here. Remember my story, and whatever you do, don't stop searching for the truth. There were 5 of us that met up around 11 p.m. Me, Jake, Lisa, Chris, and Megan. We had our usual gear, flashlights, cameras, gloves, and backpacks with water and snacks. The warehouse was about a 20-minute drive outside the city limits. As we pulled up, I remember feeling a strange sense of unease. The building loomed before us, a hulking shadow against the night sky. No lights were visible inside or around the perimeter. "Looks pretty creepy," Lisa whispered as we got out of the car. "That's what makes it fun," Jake replied with a grin. He was always the most adventurous of our group. We made our way to a side entrance, carefully prying open a rusty door. The interior was pitch black. Our flashlight beams cut through the darkness, revealing piles of debris and abandoned machinery. Everything was coated in a thick layer of dust. As we explored the first floor, taking photos and examining old equipment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was too quiet. Usually these old buildings had signs of squatters or teenagers partying, but this place felt completely untouched. We were about to head up to the second floor when I heard it, a faint chanting coming from somewhere below us. I signaled to the others to be quiet and listen. Their eyes widened as they heard it too. "What the hell is that?" Chris whispered. "Sounds like it's coming from the basement," Megan replied. "Should we check it out?" Part of me wanted to just leave right then and there. But curiosity got the better of me. We carefully made our way down a set of stairs, following the sound. As we got closer, I could make out multiple voices chanting in a language I didn't recognize. At the bottom of the stairs was a heavy metal door. Warm candlelight flickered from underneath. Jake slowly pushed it open, and we peered inside. What I saw next will haunt me for the rest of my days. The basement was a massive open space. In the center was a large circular symbol painted on the floor in what looked horribly like blood. Candles surrounded the circle, casting an eerie glow. But it was the people that made my blood run cold. At least 24 figures in dark hooded robes stood around the circle, swaying as they chanted. In the center was some kind of altar with a person lying on it, though I couldn't make out any details. We all froze in shock, unable to process what we were seeing. That's when one of the robed figures turned and spotted us. They let out a piercing shriek and pointed in our direction. Suddenly, all eyes were on us. "Run!" I screamed. We turned and bolted up the stairs, pure adrenaline and terror fueling us. But they were faster. As we reached the main floor, dark shapes emerged from every shadow. Hands grabbed at my clothes and limbs. I heard the screams of my friends as they were caught. Something struck me from behind, and I fell hard onto the concrete floor. Before I could get up, multiple people were on top of me, pinning me down. A cloth was pressed over my mouth and nose. I struggled desperately, but quickly felt myself losing consciousness as darkness overtook me. I'm not sure how long I was out. When I came to, I was lying on a cold metal surface. My eyes flew open in panic as the memories came flooding back. I tried to move but found myself tightly bound. Looking around, I realized with horror that I was on the altar in the center of the blood-painted circle. The robed figures stood silently around me, their faces hidden in shadow. One approached carrying an ornate dagger. Terror unlike anything I've ever known gripped me. I thrashed wildly against my bonds, screaming for help, but there was no escape. The figure raised the dagger above me as the others began to chant once more. I squeezed my eyes shut, certain my life was about to end. But instead of plunging into my chest, I felt the cool metal trace symbols on my forehead. The chanting grew louder, building to a fever pitch. A strange, tingling sensation began to spread through my body. When I opened my eyes, I saw tendrils of some kind of dark energy emanating from the circle, coiling around me. The air grew thick and heavy. It felt like reality itself was warping. Suddenly, a deafening, inhuman shriek filled the air. The robed figures stumbled back. In the center of the circle, a tear seemed to open in the very fabric of space. Through it, I caught a glimpse of something that defies description. A writhing mass of tentacles and eyes that hurt my mind to look at. Absolute chaos erupted. The robed figures scattered in terror. Whatever dark forces they had summoned were clearly beyond their control. In the confusion, I felt my bonds loosen. Without thinking, I rolled off the altar and ran. My only thought was escape. I raced up the stairs, my legs burning. Behind me, I heard unearthly howls and screams of agony. I didn't look back. I just ran and ran until I burst out of the warehouse into the cool night air. I didn't stop running until I reached the main road. Only then did I realize I was alone. There was no sign of my friends. Gasping for breath, I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and called 911. The next few hours were a blur. Police and emergency vehicles swarmed the area. They found no trace of the robed figures or my friends. The symbols on the floor were gone, with no evidence of the horrors I had witnessed. I've spent countless hours with investigators and therapists in the months since that night. They say there's no evidence to support my wild story. That the trauma of whatever really happened has caused me to fabricate these memories. But I know what I saw, what I felt. I still have nightmares about that thing I glimpsed coming through the portal. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, certain I can hear faint chanting in the distance. The doctors say the strange symbols that sometimes appear on my skin are just stress-induced hives. But I know the truth. Whatever forces were unleashed that night are still out there, and I fear they're not done with me yet. So I'm sharing my story as a warning. Be careful what dark corners of the world you choose to explore. Some things are better left undisturbed. I never thought something like this could happen to me. You hear stories about stalkers and creeps, but you always think, that'll never be me. Well, I was wrong. Dead wrong. It was a Friday night and I'd just gotten off work. I'm a bartender at this little dive bar downtown, so I usually don't get home until 2 or 3 in the morning. I was exhausted after a long shift and just wanted to get home and crash. As I was walking to my car in the dimly lit parking lot behind the bar, I got this weird feeling. You know that prickly sensation on the back of your neck when you feel like someone's watching you? Yeah, that. I looked around but didn't see anyone. Still, I picked up my pace a bit as I headed to my beat-up Honda Civic. I got in and locked the doors right away. As I was pulling out of the lot, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw headlights behind me. Not that unusual. I figured it was probably just another employee leaving. But as I drove, I noticed the car was staying pretty close behind me. It's fine, I told myself. You're just being paranoid because you're tired. But the car kept following me, turn after turn. My hands were starting to sweat on the steering wheel. Every time I changed lanes, they changed lanes too. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe we just happened to be going the same way. But as the minutes ticked by and they stayed right on my tail, that sick feeling in my stomach grew. I decided to test it. Instead of turning onto my street, I made a random right turn down a side road. Sure enough, the car behind me turned too. My heart started racing. This wasn't a coincidence. Trying to stay calm, I pulled out my phone to call 911, but my hands were shaking so bad I could barely dial. As I fumbled with the phone, I glanced up just in time to see the road curve sharply. I jerked the wheel, narrowly avoiding going into a ditch. The phone clattered to the floor. Shit, 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 I muttered, gripping the wheel with white knuckles. I had no idea where I was now. The streets here were dark and unfamiliar. Houses were few and far between. I was lost, being chased by some psycho, with no way to call for help. Panic started to set in. Suddenly the car behind me sped up. They were right on my bumper now, so close I couldn't even see their headlights. I floored it, pushing my old Civic as fast as it would go. The engine whined in protest. We careened around turns, blowing through stop signs. I was terrified of crashing, but even more terrified of what would happen if they caught me. My mind raced with horrible possibilities. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I saw lights up ahead. A gas station. My heart leapt. I screeched into the parking lot, tires squealing. The other car followed. I threw my car into park and scrambled out, planning to run inside for help. But before I could take 2 steps, a figure emerged from the car behind me. It was a man, tall and solidly built. He wore dark clothes and a baseball cap pulled low, obscuring his face. My blood ran cold as he strode purposefully towards me. "Stay back," I yelled, my voice shaking. "I'm calling the police." He kept coming. I backed away, fumbling for my phone before remembering it was still on the floor of my car. "You don't want to do this," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "People know where I am. They'll come looking for me." The man chuckled, a low, menacing sound that made my skin crawl. "No one's looking for you, Amber," he said. I froze. How did he know my name? What do you want?" I stammered. He was only a few feet away now. I could smell stale cigarette smoke on his clothes. "I've been watching you for a while," he said casually, like we were having a normal conversation. "I know all about you, where you work, where you live, that little cafe you like to go to on Sunday mornings, how you always order a vanilla latte." My mind reeled. This guy had been stalking me for who knows how long, and I'd had no idea. How could I have been so oblivious? "Please," I whispered, "just leave me alone. I won't tell anyone, I swear." He laughed again. "Oh, Amber, you're not going anywhere. We're just getting started." He lunged forward suddenly, grabbing my arm. I screamed and tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron. Just then, headlights swept across the parking lot. A truck pulled in, country music blaring from the speakers. The driver, a burly guy in a flannel shirt, jumped out. "Hey!" he shouted. "What's going on here?" My stalker hesitated for a split second. It was enough. I wrenched my arm free and ran towards the truck driver. "Help me!" I cried. "He's been following me. He tried to grab me." The driver's friend got out of the passenger side. They both moved to stand between me and my attacker. "You better get out of here, buddy," the driver said, his voice hard. For a tense moment, I thought the stalker might try to fight, but then he backed away slowly. "This isn't over," he said, looking right at me. Then he got in his car and peeled out of the lot. I burst into tears, the fear and adrenaline finally overwhelming me. The two guys were super kind, offering to call the police and stay with me until they arrived. The next few hours were a blur of giving statements to bored-looking officers and answering the same questions over and over. They said they'd increase patrols in my neighborhood, but I could tell they didn't take it too seriously. After all, nothing had really happened, right? But something had happened. My sense of safety, of normalcy, had been shattered. This guy knew everything about me. He'd been watching me for who knows how long, and he was still out there. I couldn't go back to my apartment. What if he knew where I lived? I ended up staying with a coworker for a few days. I was jumpy, paranoid. Every car that drove by made me flinch. I kept expecting to see him around every corner. I tried to go back to work, to my normal routine. But nothing felt normal anymore. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if he was out there watching me. The worst part was not knowing why. Why me? What did this creep want? Was it random, or had he targeted me specifically? The questions haunted me. Weeks went by with no sign of him. Gradually, I started to relax a little. Maybe it was over. Maybe he'd moved on to someone else. The thought made me feel guilty. I wouldn't wish this terror on anyone. But then one day, I got home from work to find a note taped to my door. My blood ran cold as I read the words scrawled in messy handwriting. "I'm still watching, Amber. Always watching." I called the police again, but they said there wasn't much they could do. No threats had been made, technically. They took the note as evidence, but I knew nothing would come of it. That was 3 months ago. I've moved twice since then. I've changed my routines, my habits. I'm hypervigilant, always on guard. But I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there somewhere, watching and waiting. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. The experience has changed me fundamentally. I'm not the same carefree person I was before. That Amber died in a gas station parking lot, replaced by someone warier, more cynical. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, if the stress and late nights just got to me and I invented this whole scenario. But then I remember the cold grip on my arm, the smell of smoke, the mocking tone of his voice as he recited details of my life. It was real, too real. I don't know what the future holds. Will he come back? Will I ever know why he chose me? All I can do is stay vigilant and try to reclaim some sense of normalcy in my life. But I'll never forget that night, or the realization that sometimes the monsters are real, and they know your name. I never thought I'd be thrust into the middle of a medical mystery that would threaten our entire town. As the only doctor in our small community of Millbrook, I was used to dealing with the usual colds, broken bones, and occasional emergencies. But nothing could have prepared me for the terrifying epidemic that struck without warning one fateful summer. It started on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I had just finished my first cup of coffee when urgent calls began flooding the clinic. Patients were showing up with bizarre symptoms, severe nausea, dizziness, skin rashes, and in some cases, unexplained seizures. At first, I thought it might be some kind of food poisoning outbreak. But as the hours wore on and more people poured in, I realized we were dealing with something far more serious. By noon, the waiting room was overflowing. I worked frantically, trying to triage the most severe cases while also attempting to gather information. The victims ranged from young children to the elderly, with no clear pattern. Whatever this was, it didn't discriminate. As I examined patient after patient, a disturbing commonality emerged. Nearly all of them lived in the eastern part of town, near the old chemical plant. My mind raced, considering the possibilities. Could there have been some kind of leak or contamination? I called the mayor and urged him to declare a state of emergency. We needed outside help, and fast. But as I hung up the phone, a chill ran down my spine. The chemical plant was owned by the mayor's brother-in-law. Would that influence how seriously he took the situation? With no time to waste, I grabbed my medical bag and jumped in my car. I had to investigate the plant myself. As I drove, I noticed an acrid smell in the air that grew stronger as I approached the facility. My heart pounded as I pulled up to the rusted gates. The guard seemed surprised to see me, but let me through when I flashed my doctor's ID. Inside, the place was eerily quiet. Most of the workers must have already fallen ill. I made my way to the main office, fighting waves of nausea. That's when I saw it, a corroded pipeline snaking along the ground, with a visible crack oozing a sickly green liquid. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a minor leak. The town's groundwater was likely contaminated. I snapped some photos with my phone and hurried back to my car, my mind reeling. I had to alert the EPA and get the National Guard involved. But first, I needed to warn the townspeople. Racing back to the clinic, I nearly collided with an ambulance rushing in the opposite direction. The situation was escalating rapidly. I burst through the doors to find absolute chaos. Every bed was full, with more patients lining the hallways. My nurse, Jenny, looked at me with panic in her eyes. "Dr. Evans, what's happening? We're completely overwhelmed." I took a deep breath, trying to project calm I didn't feel. "It's the chemical plant. There's been a major leak contaminating the water supply. We need to get everyone on bottled water immediately and evacuate the eastern side of town." Jenny's face paled, but she nodded resolutely. "I'll start making calls." For the next several hours, it was a blur of treating patients, coordinating with emergency services, and trying desperately to get through to state officials. The mayor was nowhere to be found, likely in damage control mode to protect his family's interests. As night fell, The true scope of the disaster became clear. Over 200 people had been sickened, with dozens in critical condition. We'd set up a makeshift triage center in the high school gym, but resources were stretched to the breaking point. I hadn't slept in over 30 hours, running on pure adrenaline and coffee. My eyes burned as I pored over lab results, trying to identify the specific toxins we were dealing with. Without that information, we were flying blind in our treatment efforts. A commotion outside drew my attention. I looked out the window to see news vans pulling up. Word had finally gotten out beyond our little town. Part of me was relieved. We desperately needed the attention and resources. But I also knew things were about to get a whole lot more complicated. As if on cue, my phone rang. It was an EPA official demanding answers. I filled him in on what I knew, emphasizing the urgent need for specialized equipment and personnel. He assured me a team was on the way, but it would be hours before they arrived. Hanging up, I turned to find Jenny at my elbow. "Dr. Evans, you need to see this," she said, handing me a tablet. It was a local news live stream. My blood ran cold as I saw the mayor giving a press conference, downplaying the situation and claiming it was just a bad case of flu going around. Fury coursed through me. How dare he lie when people were fighting for their lives? Without thinking, I stormed out of the clinic and marched straight up to the cameras. "Mayor Thompson is not telling you the truth," I said, my voice shaking with emotion. "This is a toxic chemical spill from the plant owned by his brother-in-law. I've seen the evidence myself." The mayor's face turned purple with rage, but I pressed on, laying out everything I knew. As I spoke, I could see the shock and anger spreading through the crowd. Shouts of outrage erupted, drowning out the mayor's attempts to regain control. In that moment, I knew I'd likely torpedoed my career in this town, but I couldn't stand by and let this cover-up continue. These were my patients, my neighbors, my friends. They deserved the truth. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. State and federal agencies descended on Millbrook, setting up containment zones and decontamination stations. I worked alongside EPA scientists, helping to identify the chemicals involved and develop treatment protocols. Slowly but surely, we began to turn the tide. The leak was contained, water treatment systems were overhauled, and the most critically ill patients started to show signs of improvement. But the scars, both physical and emotional, would take far longer to heal. In the aftermath, there were investigations, lawsuits, and a complete upheaval of the town's leadership. The chemical company executives, including the mayor's brother-in-law, faced criminal charges. I testified at the trials, recounting those harrowing days in excruciating detail. It's been 2 years since the epidemic struck our town. Many families moved away, unable to feel safe here anymore. Those who stayed are still dealing with the long-term health effects. The old chemical plant stands abandoned, a stark reminder of how close we came to total disaster. As for me, I'm still here, still serving as the town doctor. It hasn't been easy. Some blame me for the economic fallout, the loss of jobs when the plant closed. Others hail me as a hero, which feels just as uncomfortable. The truth is, I was simply doing my job, protecting the health of my community, no matter the personal cost. And if faced with the same situation again, I'd make the exact same choice. Because at the end of the day, a doctor's duty is to their patients, not to politics or profits. The epidemic changed me, changed all of us. It opened my eyes to the dangers lurking beneath the surface of our seemingly idyllic small-town life. Now, with each patient I see, each diagnosis I make, I'm acutely aware of the broader implications, the potential for catastrophe that can spring from a single overlooked detail. But it also showed me the resilience of the human spirit, the way a community can come together in a crisis. Through all the fear and pain, I witnessed countless acts of kindness and bravery. Neighbors helping neighbors, strangers becoming friends in the face of shared adversity. As I sit here in my office, looking out at the town slowly rebuilding itself, I'm filled with a mix of emotions: sadness for what we lost, pride in how we persevered, and hope for a safer, more transparent future. The epidemic may have been contained, but its lessons will stay with me for the rest of my life. And so, I keep watch, ready to sound the alarm if needed, determined to never let complacency or corruption threaten my patients again. Because sometimes, being a good doctor means being more than just a healer. It means being a guardian, a truth teller, and a voice for those who cannot speak for themselves. There were 5 of us: me, Jake, Lisa, Mike, and Olivia. We'd been planning this trip for months, eager to get away from the city and spend some time in nature. We chose a remote campsite deep in the national forest, about a 3-hour drive from home. The plan was to hike in, set up camp, and spend a few days exploring the wilderness. The drive out there was uneventful. We were all in high spirits, joking around and singing along to music. It was a beautiful sunny day as we arrived at the trailhead and shouldered our heavy packs. The hike to our campsite was about 5 miles through dense forest. About halfway there, I started to get an uneasy feeling. The woods seemed unnaturally quiet, no birds chirping, no rustling in the underbrush. Just an eerie silence. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't quite relax. We reached the campsite in the late afternoon and quickly set about pitching our tents and gathering firewood. As dusk fell, we got a fire going and sat around roasting hot dogs and marshmallows. Despite the good company, I still felt on edge. The shadows cast by the firelight seemed to dance and shift in unsettling ways. Around 10 p.m., we decided to turn in for the night. Jake and Lisa shared one tent, Mike and Olivia another, and I had my own small one-person tent. I tossed and turned for a while, unable to fall asleep. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made me start. I must have eventually dozed off, because I jolted awake sometime in the early hours of the morning. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. Then I heard it, chanting, faint but unmistakable, carried on the night air. My heart started pounding. I unzipped my tent as quietly as I could and peeked out. The campsite was bathed in pale moonlight. Nothing seemed amiss, but the chanting continued, seeming to come from deeper in the forest. Against my better judgment, I slipped out of the tent to investigate. I crept through the trees, following the sound. As I got closer, I could make out flickering firelight. Staying low and hidden behind bushes, I edged forward until I could see the source. In a small clearing stood about a dozen robed figures arranged in a circle. In the center was a crude stone altar, upon which lay something. I couldn't quite make it out in the dim light. The figures swayed as they chanted in a language I didn't recognize. My blood ran cold as I realized I had stumbled upon some kind of cult ritual. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was frozen in place. Suddenly, the chanting stopped. As one, the robed figures turned to look directly at me. Panic exploded in my chest. I scrambled to my feet and ran blindly through the forest. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush. I could hear shouts and pounding footsteps behind me. I burst into our campsite, screaming at my friends to wake up. They emerged from their tents, confused and alarmed. "We have to go now," I yelled. "There's people chasing us." We had no time to break camp. We grabbed what we could and ran. The sounds of pursuit grew closer. As we fled down the trail, dark shapes materialized out of the trees around us. Hands grabbed at our clothes and hair. Mike went down with a cry as one of the cultists tackled him. Olivia stopped to help him. "Keep going," she shouted to the rest of us. "We'll catch up." Jake, Lisa, and I pressed on. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like lead. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, we broke out of the tree line onto the main road where we'd parked. Our van was still there. Jake fumbled with the keys, hands shaking. We piled in and he gunned the engine just as shadowy figures emerged from the forest. We peeled out onto the road, tires squealing. "Oh God, Mike and Olivia," Lisa sobbed. "We left them behind." "We'll call for help as soon as we get cell service," Jake said grimly, hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. We drove in tense silence for about 20 minutes before Jake's phone chirped, indicating we had a signal. He immediately pulled over and dialed 911. Jake quickly explained the situation to the dispatcher. They said they would send police and search and rescue to the area immediately. We gave them directions to the campsite and descriptions of Mike and Olivia. Dawn was just breaking as we pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner. We were filthy, scraped up, and shell-shocked. Over coffee and greasy breakfast food, we tried to process what had happened. "What the hell did we stumble into back there?" Lisa asked, voice shaky. I described what I had seen in the clearing. Jake and Lisa looked horrified. "Jesus," Jake muttered. "Some kind of satanic cult or something?" We gave our statements to the police when they arrived. They seemed skeptical at first, but our terror was genuine. They assured us they would do everything possible to find Mike and Olivia. The next 48 hours were agonizing. We stayed at a nearby motel, barely sleeping, jumping at every sound. News crews descended on the small town as word got out about the missing hikers. On the third day, we got the call we'd been desperately hoping for. Mike and Olivia had been found alive. They were dehydrated, scratched up, and traumatized, but alive. When we were finally able to see them in the hospital, they told us their harrowing story. After we'd gotten separated, they'd managed to lose their pursuers and hide. They spent 2 terrifying days evading the cultists before finally making it back to the road where a passing car spotted them. The police scoured the area but found no trace of the cult or their camp. It was like they'd vanished into thin air. All they found was our abandoned campsite. In the weeks and months that followed, we all struggled with nightmares and anxiety. Mike and Olivia had the worst of it. They jumped at shadows and loud noises. Olivia couldn't even look at religious symbols without panicking. We went to therapy, both individually and as a group. Slowly, we began to heal, but none of us will ever forget that night in the woods. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of chanting echoing in my ears. The 5 of us have grown closer through this shared trauma. We don't go camping anymore, but we do have regular movie nights and game days. It helps to be around people who understand. I don't know if we'll ever get answers about what really happened out there. Was it truly a cult? Some kind of mass hallucination? I try not to dwell on it too much. But I know I'll carry the memory of that terrifying night with me for the rest of my life. If you're planning a camping trip, my advice is this: stick to well-traveled areas. Don't go too deep into the backcountry. And if you hear chanting in the woods in the middle of the night, run. Run as fast as you can and don't look back. I never thought I'd be the one to uncover something so horrifying in my own neighborhood. It all started about 6 months ago when Mr. Sears moved in next door. At first, he seemed like a normal, quiet guy, kept to himself mostly, but would give a polite wave if we crossed paths. But as the weeks went by, I started noticing some odd things. It was little things at first. Strange noises coming from his house late at night, packages being delivered at odd hours, the occasional whiff of chemical smells wafting from his property. I tried to brush it off, not wanting to be that nosy neighbor who jumps to conclusions. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. One night I was up late working on my laptop when I heard a loud thud from next door, followed by what sounded like muffled screaming. My heart started racing as I debated what to do. Should I call the police? What if it was nothing and I looked like an idiot? I decided to at least peek out the window to see if I could spot anything suspicious. As I carefully pulled back the curtain, I saw Mr. Sears hurriedly carrying what looked like a large, heavy garbage bag to his car. Even in the dim streetlight, I could see dark stains on the bag. My blood ran cold. Was that blood? No, it couldn't be. I must be imagining things. But deep down, a horrible suspicion was starting to form. From that night on, I found myself obsessively watching Mr. Sears' house, noting his comings and goings. I started taking photos whenever I saw anything odd, more suspicious packages, strange visitors at odd hours. I even invested in a pair of binoculars to get a closer look when I could. I knew I was probably crossing some lines, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something seriously wrong was happening right next door. About a month into my amateur investigation, I hit pay dirt. Mr. Sears had gone out for the evening, and I noticed he'd left his basement window slightly ajar. The temptation was too much. I had to know what was going on in there. Heart pounding, I snuck over to his property and peered inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. The basement was set up like some kind of makeshift lab, with all kinds of chemical equipment and containers. But that wasn't the worst part. Pinned to one wall were dozens of photos of local women and children, some with red X's drawn through them. In that moment, all my worst fears were confirmed. Mr. Sears wasn't just a harmless eccentric. He was a monster. I ran home in a panic, unsure of what to do next. Should I go straight to the police? But what if they didn't believe me? I had no real proof beyond my own observations. I needed hard evidence if I was going to take down this sicko. Over the next few weeks, I redoubled my efforts to gather intel. I followed Mr. Sears when he went out, noting everywhere he went. I set up a hidden camera pointed at his driveway to track his movements. I even went through his trash a few times, as gross as that was. Slowly but surely, I began to piece together a picture of his activities. It seemed Mr. Sears was involved in some kind of human trafficking operation. He would scout out potential victims, mostly vulnerable women and children, and pass that information along to his associates. I overheard phone conversations about shipments and merchandise that made me sick to my stomach. The chemical lab in his basement appeared to be for manufacturing drugs to keep the victims compliant. I knew I had to act soon before more innocent people got hurt. But I was terrified of confronting Mr. Sears directly. Who knew what he was capable of? I decided my best bet was to compile all my evidence and take it straight to the police. I spent days organizing everything I had gathered, photos, videos, notes on his activities, even some incriminating documents I'd managed to fish out of his trash. Finally, I felt I had enough to make a solid case. I headed to the police station, my heart racing the whole way there. What if they didn't believe me? What if Mr. Sears found out I'd ratted him out? But I knew I had to do the right thing, no matter the consequences. To my immense relief, the detectives took my information seriously. They pored over everything I'd brought, asking lots of follow-up questions. After a few hours, They told me they had enough to get a warrant to search Mr. Sears's property. I felt a huge weight lift off my shoulders. Finally, this nightmare might be coming to an end. The next morning, I watched from my window as a swarm of police cars descended on Mr. Sears' house. They led him out in handcuffs as other officers combed through the property. The look of shock and anger on his face when he spotted me watching is something I'll never forget. In that moment, I knew he realized it was me who had brought him down. Over the following days, the full extent of Mr. Sears' crimes came to light. The police found extensive evidence of his trafficking operation, as well as some truly gruesome discoveries in that basement lab of his. I won't go into the details, but suffice it to say, that man was responsible for unthinkable suffering. It's been a few months now since Mr. Sears was arrested. He's awaiting trial on a laundry list of charges, and from what I've heard, he's likely to spend the rest of his life behind bars. I should feel relieved, and part of me does, but I can't shake the lingering fear and paranoia. Every time I hear a noise at night, I find myself wondering if it's one of Mr. Sears's associates coming for revenge. I know I did the right thing in bringing that monster to justice, but sometimes I wonder at what cost. Will I ever feel truly safe in my own home again? Will I ever be able to trust my neighbors or live a normal life? Only time will tell, I suppose. For now, I'm just trying to take things one day at a time and remind myself that at least I helped save future victims from a terrible fate. That has to count for something, right? In the end, I guess the biggest lesson I've learned is that you never really know what's going on behind closed doors. The quiet, polite neighbor next door could be hiding the darkest of secrets. It's a chilling thought, but one I'll never be able to shake after what I've been through. All I can do now is stay vigilant and hope that if I ever encounter evil like that again, I'll have the courage to stand up and do something about it. My husband and I had just moved into our new home on the outskirts of town with our 2 young kids, ages 6 and 8. We were excited about the big backyard that backed right up to a dense forest. The realtor had sold us on all the hiking and exploring we could do as a family. If only we had known what was lurking in those woods. It was a crisp autumn evening, and we decided to have a little backyard campfire to roast marshmallows. The kids were having a blast, giggling and getting sticky marshmallow all over their faces. As the sun started to set, casting long shadows across the yard, I noticed my daughter kept glancing nervously towards the tree line. "What's wrong, sweetie?" I asked. She hesitated before answering in a small voice. "I think I saw someone in the trees." I laughed it off, telling her it was probably just a deer or some other animal. But a chill ran down my spine as I peered into the darkening forest. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw movement too. As night fell, an eerie stillness settled over us. The usual chorus of crickets and frogs was oddly absent. Even the crackling of our campfire seemed muted somehow. That's when we first heard it, a faint chanting coming from deep in the woods. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but then I saw my husband tense up, and I knew he heard it too. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite singing, not quite speaking. The voices seemed to ebb and flow, sometimes sounding far away, other times uncomfortably close. "Maybe it's just some teenagers messing around," my husband suggested, but his voice wavered with uncertainty. I gathered the kids close, suddenly eager to get back inside our house. But as we started to pack up, the chanting grew louder. It was definitely moving closer. My heart began to race as I made out words in a language I didn't recognize. That's when my son let out a terrified shriek. "Mom, there's people in the trees!" I whipped my head around and felt the blood drain from my face. Shadowy figures were emerging from the forest, still chanting in that bizarre tongue. They moved with an unnatural gliding gait that made my skin crawl. I couldn't make out any features in the darkness. They seemed more like living shadows than people. "Get in the house now!" my husband yelled, scooping up our youngest while I grabbed our daughter's hand. We sprinted for the back door, the chanting growing to a fevered pitch behind us. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door unlocked. Just as we tumbled inside, I felt icy fingers brush against the back of my neck. I slammed the door shut and locked it, then ran through the house, making sure every entrance was secured. We huddled together in the living room, listening in terror as the chanting circled our house. It was loudest near the windows, and a few times I could have sworn I saw faces peering in at us, but they vanished as soon as I looked directly at them. This went on for what felt like hours. The kids were sobbing, and I wasn't far behind them. My husband tried calling the police, but his cell phone wouldn't connect. When he tried the landline, all we heard was that same chanting coming through the receiver. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, everything went silent. The sudden quiet was almost as unnerving as the chanting had been. We sat frozen, barely daring to breathe, straining our ears for any sound. After about 15 minutes of silence, my husband cautiously peeked out the window. The yard was empty. No shadowy figures, no sign that anything had been amiss. Even our campfire was out, though we had left it burning in our haste to get inside. We spent a sleepless night huddled together, jumping at every creak of the house settling. When dawn finally broke, I half expected to see some evidence of what had happened. Footprints in the dirt, maybe some kind of strange symbols left behind. But there was nothing. If it weren't for the haunted looks on all our faces, I might have been tempted to believe it was all just a shared nightmare. We tried to go about our day normally, but we were all on edge. The kids refused to go anywhere near the backyard. I found myself obsessively checking and rechecking the locks. My husband called a realtor about putting the house back on the market, but we both knew we'd have a hard time explaining why we wanted to move so soon after buying the place. As evening approached, the dread started to build again. What if they came back? We decided to sleep in the living room again, away from the bedrooms with their forest-facing windows. I don't think any of us really slept. We just dozed fitfully, snapping awake at the slightest sound. But the night passed uneventfully. So did the next night, and the next. Slowly, we started to relax a little. Maybe it had been a one-time thing. Maybe we really had just worked ourselves up over nothing. It was about a week later when things got weird again. I was doing laundry when I noticed some odd stains on my daughter's pajamas, dark smudges that almost looked like handprints. When I asked her about it, she got really quiet and said she didn't want to talk about it. I tried not to push, but I was worried. That night, I stayed up late, watching her bedroom door. Around 2 a.m., I saw her walk out, eyes open but blank, like she was sleepwalking. She headed straight for the back door. My blood ran cold as I noticed she was softly humming that same chant we had heard in the woods. I ran to her, scooping her up before she could unlock the door. She snapped awake, confused and crying. When I asked what she had been doing, she said she had been having a dream about the shadow people calling her to come play. We moved out the very next day, leaving most of our stuff behind. We're staying with my parents now while we figure out our next move. I don't know if we'll ever be able to explain what happened to us. Part of me hopes it was all just some elaborate prank or shared delusion. But deep down, I know what we experienced was real. I still hear that chanting sometimes, right on the edge of sleep. And sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I catch glimpses of shadowy figures watching us. I don't know if they followed us here or if I'm just paranoid now. All I know is that I'll never look at the woods the same way again. And if you ever hear strange chanting coming from the trees, run, run, and don't look back. It was Jake's idea to check out the old Westbrook Memorial Hospital on the outskirts of town. He'd heard rumors about it being haunted and thought it would be cool to explore. I was hesitant at first. Trespassing in an abandoned building seemed risky. But Jake, his girlfriend Mia, and our other friend Chris were all excited about it, so I reluctantly agreed to go along. We decided to go on a Friday night, figuring there'd be less chance of getting caught after dark. As we drove out to the hospital, located on a secluded road surrounded by woods, I felt a growing sense of unease. The dilapidated building loomed ahead of us, its windows dark and empty like hollow eye sockets. "This place gives me the creeps," I muttered as we got out of the car. "Don't be such a baby," Jake teased. "It'll be fun." We used our phone flashlights to illuminate the way as we approached the main entrance. The front doors were chained shut, but we found a broken window on the side of the building that we could climb through. I hesitated, but the others were already scrambling inside. Not wanting to be left alone in the dark, I followed. The interior was pitch black and eerily silent. Our footsteps echoed on the cracked linoleum floors as we made our way down a long corridor. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust. Old medical equipment and overturned gurneys cluttered the hallways. The musty smell of decay filled my nostrils. "Let's check out the patient rooms," Chris suggested, shining his light toward a sign for the East Wing. As we explored the abandoned patient rooms, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Shadows seemed to flicker at the edge of my vision. More than once, I thought I heard faint whispers or the shuffle of footsteps, only to turn and find nothing there. "Guys, maybe we should head back," I said nervously. "This place is really creeping me out." "Don't be such a scaredy cat," Mia laughed. "We've barely seen anything yet. I want to find the morgue." I reluctantly followed as they continued deeper into the hospital. We came across an old nurse's station, its counters still cluttered with moldy paperwork and rusty medical instruments. Jake picked up a scalpel, pretending to be a deranged doctor. "Time for your operation," he cackled, lunging at Chris. "Knock it off, man," Chris said, pushing him away. "That thing's probably covered in tetanus." As Jake set the scalpel back down, I noticed something strange. While everything else was coated in decades of dust, there was a clean spot on the counter where the scalpel had been, as if it had recently been moved. A chill ran down my spine. Guys, I don't think we're alone in here." But they had already moved on, heading toward a door marked "Basement Access." My heart started racing as we descended the dark stairwell. The basement felt even more oppressive, the air thick and stagnant. We found ourselves in a maze of storage rooms and maintenance areas. As we turned a corner, our lights fell on a disturbing sight, what looked like fresh bloody handprints smeared on the wall. "Holy shit," Chris whispered. "Is that real blood?" Before anyone could answer, we heard a blood-curdling scream echoing from somewhere deeper in the basement. We all froze in terror. "What the fuck was that?" Mia gasped. It's probably just the wind or something," Jake said, his voice shaking. "Come on, let's keep going." But as we continued forward, the screaming grew louder. It sounded agonized, inhuman. My whole body was trembling as we approached a closed door at the end of the hall. The screams seemed to be coming from inside. Jake reached for the doorknob. "Wait, don't," I started to say, but it was too late. He flung the door open. Our flashlights illuminated a horrific scene. The room looked like some kind of makeshift operating theater. Rusty surgical tools were laid out on a blood-stained table, and strapped to an old hospital bed was something that used to be human. Its body was emaciated, skin stretched taut over protruding bones. Crude stitches crisscrossed its torso, as if it had been cut open and sewn back together multiple times. But most terrifying was its face, or rather, lack of one. Where facial features should have been was just a blank expanse of scarred flesh. As our lights hit it, the thing began thrashing violently against its restraints, unleashing that awful, inhuman scream. We all stumbled backward in horror. Oh my God, Mia sobbed. "We need to get out of here now," I yelled. We turned to run, but standing in the doorway was a tall figure in a blood-spattered doctor's coat. His face was hidden behind an old-fashioned plague doctor mask with a long bird-like beak. In a raspy voice he said, "Ah, more test subjects. How fortunate. The procedure can begin." Everything after that is a blur of terror and adrenaline. We shoved past the masked figure and ran blindly through the dark basement corridors, that awful screaming echoing behind us. I remember racing up the stairs, through the abandoned halls, desperate to find a way out. Somehow we made it back to the broken window we'd entered through. We practically dove out of it, scraping ourselves on the jagged glass in our haste to escape. We sprinted to the car and peeled out of there as fast as we could. We drove straight to the police station to report what we'd seen. But when officers went to investigate, they found no evidence of any recent activity in the hospital. No bloody handprints, no makeshift operating room, no mutilated patient or masked doctor. They said the place looked like it had been abandoned for years. I don't know how to explain what happened that night. My friends and I don't talk about it much. It's like we all just want to forget. But I still have nightmares about that faceless thing strapped to the bed. Still wake up in a cold sweat hearing those inhuman screams. Sometimes I wonder if it was all just some kind of mass hallucination brought on by fear and an overactive imagination. But deep down, I know what I saw was real, and I can't shake the feeling that somewhere in that hospital, hidden from sight, those horrible experiments are still going on. I just pray that masked figure never finds more test subjects to torture. I'll never set foot in an abandoned building again. Some places are better left unexplored. The horrors I witnessed that night will haunt me for the rest of my life. It was a Friday night in late October. Me and my friends, Jake, Emma, and Tyler, were bored out of our minds. Our small Midwest town didn't exactly have a hopping social scene for high schoolers. We'd already exhausted our usual hangout spots, the dingy bowling alley, the one movie theater that only showed films months after they came out, the 24-hour diner with the grumpy waitress who always gave us the stink eye. Jake was the one who suggested we check out the old abandoned church on the outskirts of town. It had been shut down years ago after the congregation dwindled and had fallen into disrepair. There were always rumors floating around school about it being haunted. Stupid stuff like hearing ghostly organ music late at night or seeing faces in the grimy windows. We didn't believe any of that crap, of course. But the idea of exploring somewhere off-limits and creepy was appealing in our state of mind-numbing boredom. So we piled into Jake's beat-up Corolla and drove out there, blasting music and joking around. The church loomed up out of the darkness as we approached, a hulking Victorian-style building with a tall steeple stabbing up at the cloudy night sky. The flaking white paint looked sickly pale in the moonlight. Weeds choked the overgrown yard, and several windows were boarded up. We parked a little ways down the road and approached on foot, not wanting to draw attention. Up close, the church looked even more decrepit. Cracks spiderwebbed across the stone foundation, and the front steps were crumbling. The large wooden double doors were chained shut with a rusty padlock. "Well, this sucks," Emma said, kicking at some loose gravel. "How are we supposed to get in?" Tyler grinned and pulled a small crowbar from his backpack. "Way ahead of you. Found this in my dad's garage." We made our way around to a side entrance that looked less secure. Tyler managed to pry open one of the boards covering a broken window. One by one, we squeezed through the tight opening. The musty smell of decay hit me as soon as I tumbled inside. Dust swirled in the beam of my flashlight. We were in what looked like an old Sunday school classroom. Decrepit desks were piled in one corner, and faded Bible verses decorated the walls. "This place is nasty," Emma said, wrinkling her nose. "Let's just take a quick look around and bounce." We made our way down a hallway lined with offices and storage rooms. Everything was coated in a thick layer of grime. Old hymnals and Bibles were scattered across the floor. In one room, a torn portrait of Jesus stared down at us with eerie, faded eyes. The main sanctuary was cavernous, with soaring ceilings and rows of rotting pews. Moonlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting weird colored shadows. Our footsteps echoed ominously. "Hey guys, check this out," Jake called from near the altar. He was shining his light on a trap door set into the floor. "Think this leads to a basement or something?" A chill ran down my spine. For some reason, the idea of going further down into the bowels of this creepy old building filled me with dread. But I didn't want to seem like a wuss in front of my friends. Tyler was already yanking on the iron ring to lift the trap door. It opened with a hair-raising screech of rusted metal. Stale, dank air wafted up from the darkness below. "Ladies first," Tyler said with a smirk, gesturing to the hole. Emma punched his arm. "Hell no. You're the one so eager to go down there. You can lead the way." Tyler shrugged and started descending the rickety wooden steps, phone flashlight in hand. Jake followed, then Emma. I brought up the rear, heart pounding. The basement was pitch black except for the beams of our lights. The ceiling was low, forcing us to stoop slightly. The concrete floor was slick with some kind of moisture. I tried not to think about what it might be. "Ugh, it reeks down here," Emma complained. She was right. There was a sour, rotten smell that seemed to coat the inside of my nostrils. I fought down a wave of nausea. We picked our way carefully through the gloom. The basement seemed to be one large open space, with thick support columns placed at intervals. Piles of junk were heaped along the walls, broken furniture, moldy cardboard boxes, rusted machinery I couldn't identify. "Hey, what's that?" Jake said suddenly, pointing his light at something on the far wall. As we got closer, I realized it was some kind of symbol painted on the concrete. It looked like a 5-pointed star inside a circle, with weird squiggly writing around the edges. The dark red paint was flaking and faded, but still clearly visible. "Whoa, creepy," Tyler said. "You think this was like devil worship stuff or something?" Emma rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on. It was probably just some bored teenagers like us who snuck down here to be edgy." But I wasn't so sure. Something about that symbol made my skin crawl. I had the strongest urge to get out of there immediately. Before I could say anything, a faint sound echoed from somewhere in the darkness. We all froze. "Did you guys hear that?" I whispered. "Hear what?" Jake asked. "Shh," I hissed. "Listen." We stood stock still, straining our ears. For a moment there was only silence. Then I heard it again, a low, rhythmic chanting coming from deeper in the basement. "Oh, hell no," Emma said. "We need to leave, now." but Tyler was already moving towards the sound, as if in a trance. "I want to see what it is," he murmured. "Tyler, don't!" I grabbed for his arm, but he shook me off. Exchanging worried glances, the rest of us had no choice but to follow him. The chanting grew louder as we crept forward. I could make out multiple voices now, speaking in some language I didn't recognize. We rounded a corner and found ourselves looking down a long corridor we hadn't noticed before. At the far end, flickering light spilled from an open doorway. The chanting was definitely coming from in there. Tyler kept moving forward like a man possessed. I wanted desperately to run, but I couldn't leave my friends, so I followed, every nerve in my body screaming danger. As we neared the doorway, I began to make out words mixed in with the chanting, but they weren't in any language I recognized, just a string of harsh, guttural syllables that made my head hurt to listen to. We reached the threshold and peered inside. What I saw in that room will haunt me for the rest of my days. A group of maybe a dozen figures stood in a circle, swaying slightly as they chanted. They wore long black robes with deep hoods that completely obscured their faces. In the center of the circle was a crude stone altar. Atop it lay something. In the dim light cast by burning torches on the walls, I couldn't make out exactly what it was, but it was roughly man-sized and seemed to be moving slightly. The chanters didn't seem to notice our presence. They were completely focused on whatever ritual they were performing. As I watched in horror, one of them raised a wickedly curved dagger above their head. That's when Tyler snapped out of whatever trance he'd been in. He let out a strangled yelp of terror. The chanting stopped abruptly. A dozen hidden faces turned towards us as one. "Run!" I screamed. We bolted back the way we came, stumbling and slipping on the damp floor. I could hear the sound of pursuit behind us, along with those terrible guttural words that seemed to claw at my brain. Everything was a blur of terror and confusion. Somehow we found the stairs and scrambled up them, slamming the trapdoor shut behind us. We raced through the sanctuary and down the hall to the window we'd entered through. I was the last one out. As I wiggled through the opening, I felt something grab my ankle. I kicked wildly and tumbled to the ground outside. We sprinted to Jake's car and peeled out of there, tires squealing. We drove in shocked silence for a while, all of us panting and wide-eyed with fear. Finally, Emma spoke up in a shaky voice. What the hell was that?" None of us had an answer. We swore a pact of secrecy that night. Who would believe us anyway? But sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of that chanting echoing in my head. And I wonder, what were those hooded figures doing in that basement? What was on that altar? And what would have happened if we'd been caught? I don't have any answers. All I know is that I'll never set foot in an abandoned building again as long as I live. Some places are better left unexplored. I never thought I'd be writing this, but I feel like I need to share what happened in my town. It's been a few months since everything went down, and I'm still trying to process it all. I'm a doctor in a small town called Millbrook, population around 5,000. It's one of those places where everyone knows everyone, and nothing ever really happens. At least, that's what I thought until last summer. It started with Mr. Johnson, a regular patient of mine. He came in complaining about a weird growth on his arm. At first, I thought it was just a cyst or something benign, but when I examined it, I realized it wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. The skin around it was discolored, almost iridescent, and the growth itself seemed to pulse slightly. I took a biopsy and sent it off to the lab, figuring we'd get some answers soon. But then Mrs. Peterson came in with a similar growth on her neck. And then the Thompson's kid, little Billy, had one on his back. Within a week, I had seen over a dozen cases, all with the same bizarre symptoms. The lab results came back inconclusive, which only added to my growing sense of unease. I started doing some digging, trying to find any connection between the affected patients. The only thing they had in common was that they all lived in Millbrook. I reached out to colleagues in neighboring towns, but none of them had seen anything like it. It was isolated to our town, and that's when I knew something was seriously wrong. One night, I was working late at the clinic, poring over medical journals and trying to find any precedent for what we were dealing with. That's when I heard a noise outside. I looked out the window and saw a group of people in hazmat suits entering the old abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. It was past midnight, and there was no reason for anyone to be there, let alone people in full protective gear. I grabbed my coat and decided to follow them. Looking back, it was probably a stupid move, but I was desperate for answers. I parked my car a little way down the road and snuck up to the factory. Through a dirty window, I could see the hazmat-suited figures moving around inside, setting up equipment. It looked like some kind of makeshift lab. I managed to find a side door that was unlocked and slipped inside. The smell hit me first, a mix of chemicals and something organic, almost rotten. I crept through the shadows, trying to stay out of sight. That's when I overheard two of them talking. "The mutation rate is accelerating faster than we anticipated," one of them said. "We need to contain this before it spreads beyond Millbrook," the other replied. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they'd hear it. They were talking about the mutations as if they knew exactly what was causing them. I edged closer, trying to hear more, when I accidentally knocked over a stack of empty crates. The noise echoed through the factory, and I knew I was busted. I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. I could hear shouts behind me, but I didn't look back. I just made it to my car and sped away, my mind racing even faster than the vehicle. The next day, I tried to tell the sheriff what I'd seen, but he just looked at me like I was crazy. He said the factory had been empty for years and that I must have been working too hard. But I knew what I saw. I knew something was going on. Over the next few days, more and more people came to the clinic with mutations. Some were developing scales, others had strange growths that seemed to move on their own. The town was in a panic, and I felt completely helpless. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I started collecting samples from every patient and analyzing them myself. I worked around the clock, barely sleeping or eating. And then, finally, I found something. There was a common element in all the samples, a compound I'd never seen before. It seemed to be altering DNA at a cellular level. Armed with this information, I went back to the sheriff, but he still wouldn't listen. That's when I realized I couldn't trust anyone in town. I didn't know how deep this conspiracy went. I reached out to an old college friend who worked for the CDC. I sent her my findings and begged her to come to Millbrook. She arrived 2 days later with a team of investigators. Things moved quickly after that. The CDC team found traces of the compound in the town's water supply. They traced it back to, you guessed it, the old factory. When they raided the place, they found a fully operational lab hidden underground. It turned out that a group of rogue scientists had been using Millbrook as a testing ground for experimental gene therapy. They had been introducing the compound into the water supply gradually, monitoring the effects on the population. Their goal was to engineer improvements to the human genome, but their experiments had spiraled out of control. The CDC shut down the operation and arrested everyone involved. They brought in specialists to treat the affected townspeople, reversing most of the mutations. It took months, but slowly things started to return to normal. But here's the thing. I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Sometimes I catch glimpses of something strange out of the corner of my eye. A shimmer on someone's skin that shouldn't be there. A shadow that moves in a way shadows shouldn't move. And I wonder, did we really stop it in time? Or is there something still lurking beneath the surface of our town, waiting to emerge? I stay vigilant, watching for any signs that the mutations might be returning. The other townspeople seem eager to forget, to move on with their lives. But I can't. I won't. Because I know the truth about what happened in Millbrook, and I'll never stop watching, never stop fighting to keep my town safe. So that's my story. I don't expect anyone to believe me, but I needed to put it out there. If you ever notice anything strange in your town, don't ignore it. Don't let them tell you you're crazy, because sometimes the truth is crazier than anything you could imagine. I was so excited for my friend Jake's 25th birthday party on the lake. A group of us had rented a pontoon boat for the day to celebrate out on the water. The weather was perfect, sunny and warm with a light breeze. We packed plenty of food, drinks, and music, ready for a fun day of swimming and relaxing. Everything started off great. We cruised around the lake, taking in the scenery and enjoying each other's company. Jake was in his element, laughing and joking with all of us. I remember thinking how lucky we were to have such an awesome group of friends. As the afternoon wore on, we decided to head to a more secluded part of the lake to swim and float around for a while. That's when things took a terrifying turn. The boat's engine suddenly sputtered and died, leaving us stranded in the middle of the water. At first we weren't too worried. Jake and a couple of the other guys tried to restart it, but after several failed attempts, we realized we had a real problem on our hands. To make matters worse, we discovered none of us had cell service out there. We were truly cut off from help. A sense of unease started to creep over the group as we debated what to do next. Should we try to paddle to shore? Wait and hope another boat would come by? The sun was getting lower in the sky, and I started to worry about being stuck out there after dark. That's when we spotted another boat in the distance. Relief washed over me. Surely they would be able to help us out. But as the boat drew closer, that feeling of relief quickly turned to dread. There were 2 men on board, and something about them just felt off. They weren't smiling or waving as you'd expect from friendly boaters. Instead, they stared at us with cold, calculating expressions that sent chills down my spine. As they pulled up alongside us, Jake called out, asking if they could give us a tow back to the marina. The men ignored him completely. One of them, a tall guy with a shaved head, stood up and started to climb onto our boat. That's when we all realized the danger we were in. "Please, we just need help getting back to shore," I pleaded, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. The man glared at me with such hatred in his eyes that I actually took a step back. "Shut up," he snarled. "All of you, hand over your wallets and phones, now." My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. I looked around frantically at my friends, seeing the same fear reflected in their eyes. We were outnumbered and trapped. There was nowhere for us to run. The second man had boarded our boat by this point. He was shorter but stockier, with tattoos covering his arms. He pulled out a knife and started waving it threateningly. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he growled. "Give us what we want, and maybe we'll let you live." Time seemed to slow down as I tried to process what was happening. This birthday celebration had turned into a nightmare in the blink of an eye. I couldn't believe this was real. It felt like something out of a horror movie. Jake, always the protective one, stepped forward with his hands raised. Okay, okay. Just stay calm. We'll give you what you want. Please don't hurt anyone. As Jake reached for his wallet, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. Another boat was approaching fast in the distance. Hope surged through me. Maybe we had a chance after all. The two attackers noticed it too. They exchanged a quick glance, clearly not happy about the interruption. "Hurry up!" the man with the knife shouted, grabbing Jake roughly by the arm. In that moment, Jake made a split-second decision that likely saved all our lives. He suddenly yelled, "Jump!" and dove into the water. Without hesitation, we all followed his lead. I hit the cool water and immediately started swimming as hard as I could toward the approaching boat. I could hear splashing and shouting behind me, but I didn't dare look back. My lungs were burning and my arms felt like lead, but pure adrenaline kept me going. As I neared the other boat, I saw hands reaching down to help pull us out of the water. I grabbed on and was hauled over the side, collapsing on the deck in exhaustion. One by one, my friends were pulled to safety. I did a quick head count, my heart in my throat until I confirmed everyone had made it. We were soaking wet, shaking, and in shock, but we were alive. The family on the rescue boat, a couple with their teenage son, were incredibly kind. They immediately called the police and started heading for shore at top speed. I looked back and saw our attackers speeding off in the opposite direction, abandoning our disabled pontoon boat. When we finally reached the marina, we were met by police and paramedics. The next few hours were a blur of giving statements, being checked over by medical personnel, and trying to process the trauma of what we'd just been through. In the days and weeks that followed, I struggled with anxiety and nightmares about the attack. We all did, but we also grew closer as a group, bonded by our shared experience and gratitude for each other. To this day, I still get nervous around large bodies of water. I doubt I'll ever feel truly comfortable on a boat again, but I'm also profoundly grateful for Jake's quick thinking, for the family that rescued us, and for the second chance we were given that day. What was supposed to be a fun birthday celebration turned into the most terrifying experience of our lives. It taught me how quickly things can change and how precious life really is. I'll never take my safety or my friends for granted again, and I'll always remember that fateful day on the lake when we came face to face with true evil, but managed to escape with our lives intact. I was so excited for our camping trip to Elm Creek State Park. My boyfriend Jake and I had been planning it for weeks, a chance to get away from the city, disconnect from technology, and enjoy some time in nature together. We packed up the car on Friday afternoon and hit the road, singing along to our favorite songs and talking excitedly about the hiking trails we wanted to explore. We arrived at the campground just before sunset. The park was pretty quiet, with only a few other campsites occupied. We found a nice secluded spot near the edge of the woods and got to work setting up our tent. Jake built a fire while I laid out our sleeping bags and organized our supplies. As night fell, we roasted hot dogs and marshmallows over the crackling flames, gazing up at the stars twinkling in the clear sky above. It was so peaceful and romantic, exactly the getaway we'd been hoping for. Around 11 p.m., we doused the fire and crawled into our tent, snuggling up in our sleeping bags. Jake fell asleep almost immediately, but I lay awake for a while, listening to the soothing sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. I must have drifted off eventually, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a noise outside the tent. At first I thought it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or deer wandering through our campsite. But then I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on leaves and twigs. My heart started racing as I realized these were human footsteps, slowly circling our tent. I nudged Jake awake, whispering urgently, "Do you hear that?" He groggily sat up, confused. "What? What's going?" I clamped my hand over his mouth, terrified the person outside would hear us. Jake's eyes went wide as the footsteps came closer. We lay there frozen, hardly daring to breathe, as whoever it was walked a slow circle around our tent. The footsteps paused right next to where our heads were. I could hear heavy breathing, like they were leaning in close to the thin fabric of the tent. My whole body was trembling uncontrollably. Suddenly, a man's voice growled, "I know you're in there. I can hear you breathing." I had to bite my lip to keep from screaming. Jake's arm tightened around me protectively. The voice continued, low and menacing. "Don't try anything stupid. I've got a knife and I won't hesitate to use it. You two picked the wrong campsite tonight." Tears were streaming silently down my face. I've never felt terror like that before. The absolute helplessness of being trapped in a flimsy tent with some unknown psycho right outside. Every muscle in my body was clenched tight, ready to fight or flee, but I was paralyzed with fear. The man started pacing back and forth in front of our tent, muttering to himself. Occasionally he'd stop and lean in close again, his raspy breathing sending chills down my spine. At one point, he ran his hand along the outside of the tent, right where Jake and I were huddled together. I thought I was going to pass out from sheer panic. This torment went on for what felt like hours. Sometimes he'd go quiet for long stretches, but we could still sense his presence lurking just outside. Other times he'd start ranting, making vague threats about what he was going to do to us. I kept praying he'd just leave, or that someone else at the campground would hear and come help. But we seemed totally isolated. As the sky ever so slowly began to lighten with the approaching dawn, the man's pacing became more agitated. He was breathing heavily, almost panting. "Sun's coming up soon," he snarled. "Time's almost up for you too. Better say your goodbyes." Jake and I clung to each other, shaking uncontrollably. I truly thought we were about to die. But then, miraculously, we heard the sound of a car engine starting up in the distance. The man swore under his breath. His footsteps retreated quickly into the woods. We lay there in shocked silence for several minutes, hardly able to believe it was over. When we were sure he was gone, we burst out of the tent and ran to our car, leaving all our gear behind. Jake's hands were shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. We peeled out of that campground as fast as we could. Neither of us spoke for the first hour of the drive home. We were both in a state of shock, struggling to process what had just happened. When we finally started talking about it, we realized how lucky we were to have made it out unharmed. Why didn't the man just attack us? Was he bluffing about having a weapon? We'll never know for sure. We debated whether to report it to the police, but ultimately decided against it. We had no real evidence, and frankly, we just wanted to try to forget the whole horrifying ordeal. But I don't think I'll ever be able to forget that night of sheer terror. I still have nightmares about that menacing voice outside our tent. Needless to say, Jake and I are done with camping for good. These days we stick to nice, safe hotel rooms for our vacations. I'm sharing this story as a warning to other campers out there. You never know what kind of deranged people might be lurking in the wilderness. Please be careful and aware of your surroundings, and maybe invest in some better security than a flimsy nylon tent. I thank my lucky stars every day that we made it out of that nightmare alive. I was beyond excited for our summer lake trip. My friends and I had been planning it for months, a chance to escape the city heat and relax on the water for a few days. We'd rented a cabin by Lake Silverthorne, a secluded spot known for its pristine waters and lush forests. The day started off perfectly. We arrived at the lakeside early, the morning mist still clinging to the water's surface. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine. As we unloaded our gear, I noticed an old man watching us from the dock. He introduced himself as Earl, a local guide who offered boat tours of the lake. "Been running tours here for nigh on 50 years, Earl said with a gruff chuckle. "Know every nook and cranny of this lake like the back of my hand." Something about Earl's intense gaze made me uneasy, but my friends were already eagerly discussing hiring him for a tour. Before I could voice any objections, money had changed hands, and we were piling into Earl's rickety old pontoon boat. As we puttered away from shore, I tried to shake off my nerves. The lake was breathtakingly beautiful, its glassy surface reflecting the forested hills like a mirror. Earl pointed out various landmarks, a distinctive rock formation he called the Devil's Fist, an abandoned ranger station, a tiny island in the distance that he said was home to an old hermit. About an hour into our trip, we'd reached the center of the lake. The shoreline was just a hazy line on the horizon. Earl cut the engine, saying he wanted to tell us about the lake's history. "This here's one of the deepest lakes in the state," he said, leaning on the railing. "They say the bottom's never been found. All kinds of stories about what might be down there." As Earl spoke, I noticed dark clouds rolling in, despite the forecast calling for clear skies. A chill wind kicked up, rippling the once calm water. My friend Megan nudged me, whispering, "Is it just me or is this getting creepy?" I nodded, about to suggest we head back to shore. But when I turned to Earl, my blood ran cold. The spot where he'd been standing moments ago was empty. "Earl?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response. We searched the small boat frantically, but there was no sign of the old man. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. Panic set in as we realized we were stranded in the middle of an unfamiliar lake with no idea how to operate the boat. "Maybe he fell overboard," Jake suggested, peering into the murky water. But there was no splash, no cry for help. Earl had simply disappeared. As we argued about what to do, the sky grew darker. The wind picked up, rocking the boat. In the distance, thunder rumbled ominously. "Look!" Megan suddenly shouted, pointing. Through the gloom, I could just make out a small island maybe half a mile away. It was our only option. We had to get to land before the storm hit. After several terrifying attempts, we managed to start the boat's engine. Jake took the wheel, steering us unsteadily towards the island. Rain began to pelt us as we approached the rocky shore. We barely managed to beach the boat before the sky opened up completely. Soaked and shivering, we huddled under a stand of pines, watching sheets of rain lash the lake. Lightning illuminated the roiling water. I'd never seen a storm come on so suddenly or violently. "What the hell do we do now?" Megan asked, her voice barely audible over the wind and thunder. Before anyone could respond, I spotted movement through the trees. A figure was emerging from the depths of the small island, heading our way. My heart leapt. Maybe someone lived here who could help us. But as the person drew closer, my relief turned to icy dread. It was Earl. He walked towards us calmly, seemingly unbothered by the raging storm. When he reached our group, he smiled, the same unsettling grin from earlier. "Well now," he said, as if nothing was amiss. "Quite a storm we're having." We stared at him in shocked silence. How was this possible? Where had he gone? How did he get here? Jake was the first to find his voice. "Earl, what happened? You disappeared from the boat. We thought you'd drowned." Earl's smile never wavered. Disappeared? Why, no. I've been right here the whole time. You folks said you wanted to see the island, so here we are. A chill that had nothing to do with the rain ran down my spine. I knew with absolute certainty that Earl was lying. We'd watched him vanish with our own eyes. That's not true, I said, my voice shaking. You were gone. We searched the whole boat. For just a moment, I saw something flash in Earl's eyes, something cold and alien that made my skin crawl. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by that unnerving grin. Now, he said, his tone patronizing. You youngsters must have gotten all turned around in the excitement. But no worries. Why don't you come with me? I've got a cabin just over the hill where we can wait out this storm. He gestured deeper into the island. Through the rain-lashed trees, I thought I saw the dim outline of a structure. Everything in me screamed that we shouldn't follow this man. Megan must have felt the same. She grabbed my arm, whispering urgently, "We need to get out of here, now." I nodded, trying to catch Jake and our other friend Alex's eyes. They looked uncertain, glancing between Earl and the raging storm. "Actually," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady, "I think we should head back. Our families will be worried if we're gone too long." Earl's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "Nonsense. You can't go out in this weather. It's not safe. Come along now." He reached for Megan's arm. She jerked back with a yelp. In that moment, any lingering doubt evaporated. We had to get away from this man. "Run!" I shouted, shoving my friends towards the boat. We sprinted through the rain, slipping on wet rocks and branches. I could hear Earl behind us, his footsteps unnaturally fast for an old man. "Come back!" he called, his voice somehow carrying over the storm. "Don't you want to hear the lake's secrets?" We reached the boat, scrambling aboard. Jake gunned the engine as Alex and I pushed us off the rocky shore. I looked back as we pulled away. Earl stood at the water's edge, that terrible smile still fixed on his face. As a flash of lightning illuminated him, I could have sworn I saw something shimmer across his skin, like scales. The trip back to shore was a nightmare. Jake could barely see to steer through the storm. Waves crashed over the sides of the boat, threatening to capsize us. But somehow, we made it. We didn't stop running until we reached our car. As we peeled out of the parking lot, I glimpsed the lake one last time. The storm was already clearing, sunlight breaking through the clouds as if nothing had happened. It's been weeks, but I still have nightmares about Earl's smile and that island. I've tried researching the lake's history, looking for any clues about what we experienced, but I've found nothing concrete, just vague legends about people going missing and old tales of something living in the lake's depths. My friends and I have a silent agreement never to speak of that day, but sometimes I catch them staring at lakes or rivers with the same haunted look I see in the mirror. We know we brushed up against something impossible and terrifying, and I can't shake the feeling that we only escaped because it let us go. I was so excited for our family camping trip over the 4th of July weekend. My husband Jake, our 2 kids Emma and Liam, and I had been planning it for months. We found this beautiful, secluded spot by Lake Willow that was supposed to be perfect for getting away from the crowds and fireworks. We arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon on July 3rd. The weather was gorgeous, warm and sunny with a light breeze coming off the lake. As we set up our tent and unpacked our gear, the kids ran around exploring and collecting rocks and pine cones. Jake got a campfire going and we roasted hot dogs for dinner, followed by s'mores for dessert. It was exactly the peaceful family time we'd been hoping for. As night fell, we sat around the crackling fire telling stories and looking at the stars. The sky was so clear out there, away from the city lights. You could see the Milky Way streaking across the darkness. It was magical. Around 10 p.m. we decided to turn in for the night. We extinguished the fire carefully and zipped ourselves into the tent. I drifted off to sleep, listening to the soft lapping of the lake water on the shore and the chorus of crickets and frogs. I'm not sure what time it was when I woke up, but it was still fully dark outside. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed my sleep. Then I heard it. Voices. Multiple voices, speaking in low tones, coming from the direction of the lake. I nudged Jake awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. He listened for a moment, then nodded. We both sat up, straining our ears. The voices were getting closer. Carefully, we unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. What I saw made my blood run cold. A group of maybe 15-20 people were walking along the lakeshore, heading in our direction. They were all dressed in dark hooded robes and carried flaming torches. The firelight cast an eerie glow on the water. As they got closer, I could make out bits of what they were saying. It sounded like chanting in some language I didn't recognize. Jake and I exchanged a terrified glance. This was clearly not normal camping behavior. Something very wrong was happening. "We need to get out of here," Jake whispered urgently. I nodded in agreement. We woke Emma and Liam as quietly as possible, motioning for them to be silent. They must have sensed our fear because they didn't make a sound. We grabbed a few essentials, our phones, car keys, and a flashlight, and slipped out of the tent. The chanting was getting louder. We had to move fast. Jake led the way into the forest on the opposite side of our campsite from the approaching group. We moved as quickly and quietly as we could through the underbrush, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they would hear it. After a few minutes, Jake held up his hand for us to stop. We crouched behind some large boulders and peered back towards our campsite. The robed figures had reached the clearing where we'd been camping. They formed a circle around our tent, still chanting. One of them stepped forward and tossed something into the center of the circle. There was a bright flash and a puff of colored smoke. I clapped my hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp. What on earth were we witnessing? The chanting grew louder and more fervent. More objects were thrown into the circle, producing flashes of different colors. The air took on a strange, shimmering quality that made me feel dizzy just looking at it. Suddenly, the chanting stopped. The silence was deafening after the noise. The figures stood completely still for several long moments. Then, as one, they all raised their arms towards the sky. A bone-chilling shriek pierced the night, unlike anything I've ever heard before. It wasn't human, it wasn't animal, I don't know what it was, but it filled me with a primal terror that I can still feel when I think about it. The sound faded, and the robed figures lowered their arms. They extinguished their torches and began to disperse, melting away into the darkness around the lake. We stayed frozen in our hiding spot, barely daring to breathe. After what felt like hours but was probably only 15-20 minutes, Jake whispered that we should make a run for the car. Moving as quietly as we could, we made our way through the forest towards where we'd parked. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made me flinch, certain we were about to be discovered. Finally, we reached the dirt access road where our SUV was parked. Jake fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. We piled in, and he started the engine, not even bothering to turn on the headlights as we sped away down the bumpy road. It wasn't until we reached the main highway that we all seemed to let out a collective breath. Jake pulled over, and we sat there for a few minutes, trying to process what had just happened. "Mom? Dad? What was that?" Emma asked in a small voice. I wish I had an answer for her. I still don't, even now. We drove straight home that night, arriving as the sun was coming up. We left all our camping gear behind. I never want to see any of it again. I've spent hours searching online, trying to find any explanation for what we saw. Some kind of cult, a prank, mass hallucination. Nothing quite fits. All I know is that I'll never go camping again. And every 4th of July, instead of celebration, I'm filled with dread remembering that terrifying night by the lake. Sometimes I wonder if it was all just a vivid shared nightmare. But then I'll catch a glimpse of that same primal fear in my family's eyes when fireworks go off or we drive past a lake, and I know it was real. Too real. I don't know what those people were doing out there that night. Part of me doesn't want to know. But I do know that there are things in this world that can't be explained. Dark things that most people never see. We saw them, and we'll never be the same. Around 9 a.m., I reached the far eastern campsite area, a more secluded spot, popular with experienced campers looking for privacy. As I approached the first campsite, something felt off. It was dead silent, no sounds of campers stirring or pots clanging as breakfast was made. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I called out a hello but got no response. As I got closer, I saw that the large family-sized tent was in shambles. The front flap was torn wide open, and there were deep claw marks along the sides. My heart started racing as I noticed dark stains on the crumpled fabric, unmistakably blood. I immediately radioed for backup and began searching the area for any sign of the campers. The picnic table was overturned, food and supplies scattered everywhere. It looked like whatever attacked had come in the night, catching the poor family completely off guard. As I circled the devastated campsite, I kept getting the eerie sensation of being watched. Every few seconds I'd whip around, certain I'd seen movement in the trees. But each time there was nothing there, just shadows and silence. I knew I should wait for backup to arrive, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might still be out there, injured and in need of help. Against my better judgment, I decided to search the surrounding forest. As soon as I stepped off the trail into the dense woods, the atmosphere changed. The trees seemed to press in around me, branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Every snapping twig made me jump. That feeling of being stalked intensified with each step. I'd only gone about 50 yards when I heard it, a faint whimper coming from a thicket ahead. I called out, saying I was here to help. The whimpering got louder, and I rushed forward, pushing through the brambles. There, huddled at the base of a massive oak, was a young woman. She was covered in dirt and dried blood, her clothes torn to shreds. When she saw me, she let out a strangled sob of relief. "It's okay. I've got you," I said, kneeling beside her. "Can you tell me what happened?" Through her tears, she gasped out that something had attacked their campsite in the middle of the night. It came so fast, tearing through the tent like it was paper. Her parents told her to run while they tried to fend it off. She'd been hiding in the woods ever since, too terrified to move. I radioed in that I'd found a survivor and needed immediate medical assistance. As I tried to comfort the traumatized woman, that skin-crawling sensation of being watched returned full force. I scanned the forest around us, my hand on my sidearm. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw a pair of gleaming yellow eyes watching us from the shadows. But when I looked again, there was nothing there. The woman suddenly went rigid, her eyes wide with terror as she stared over my shoulder. I spun around, fully expecting to come face to face with whatever nightmarish creature had done this. But again, there was nothing, just trees and underbrush. My radio crackled, making us both jump. Backup had arrived at the campsite and was headed our way. I breathed a sigh of relief, knowing help was close. As we waited, I tried to get more details from the woman about the attack, but she was in shock, barely able to string a sentence together. She just kept mumbling about glowing eyes and too fast to see. When the other rangers finally reached us, we carefully carried the woman back to the campsite. As we emerged from the tree line, I noticed strange, deep gouges in the bark of several trees, like something with massive claws had been climbing them. The woman was loaded into an ambulance and rushed to the hospital. A full search was launched for her parents, but no trace was ever found. The official report blamed the attack on a rogue bear, despite the fact that no bear tracks were found in the area. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something. The claw marks I'd seen were like nothing I'd encountered in all my years as a ranger, and that persistent sense of being watched in the forest, it was unlike anything I'd experienced before. I kept going back to that campsite, searching for clues we might have overlooked. But each time I'd find myself hurrying back to my truck as darkness fell, unable to shake the sensation of predatory eyes following my every move. To this day, I'm not sure what really happened out there, but I know one thing for certain. Whatever attacked that family is still out there, hiding in the shadows of the forest. And sometimes, when I'm on patrol in that area, I swear I can hear something massive moving through the trees, always just out of sight. I've started carrying a bigger gun on my shifts, and I never ever patrol that section of the park alone anymore. Because deep down, I know the truth. We're not at the top of the food chain out there. And someday, whatever is lurking in those woods might decide to remind us of that fact again. The first few weeks were great. I quickly got the hang of helping customers choose the right boat, going over safety procedures, and handling the basic maintenance tasks. My co-workers were friendly, and I even started to develop a bit of a tan. But everything changed when Mr. Smith, the owner, returned from an extended business trip. From the moment he arrived, something felt off about Mr. Smith. He was a tall, lanky man with piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through you. At first, I chalked up his odd behavior to jet lag or stress from his trip. He'd stare at me for uncomfortably long periods, sometimes mid-conversation, as if he'd forgotten I was there. His movements were jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. As the days went by, Mr. Smith's behavior became increasingly erratic. He'd appear out of nowhere, startling me while I was working on a boat or helping a customer. I'd turn around, and there he'd be, standing unnaturally still, those icy blue eyes fixed on me. He started calling me into his office for trivial reasons, always finding an excuse to stand too close or brush against me as I left. One evening, as I was closing up the rental shack, I heard a strange scratching sound coming from the back room. Thinking it might be a raccoon or some other animal that had gotten in, I cautiously approached. As I reached for the doorknob, Mr. Smith burst out, nearly knocking me over. His eyes were wild, and there was a dark stain on his shirt that looked disturbingly like blood. "Just taking care of a little pest problem," he said with a grin that was far too wide to be natural. "Nothing for you to worry about." I nodded nervously and hurried to finish my tasks, my heart pounding in my chest. As I left that night, I could feel Mr. Smith's eyes on me, watching me from the darkened window of his office. The next day, I arrived to find the place in chaos. Several boats had been damaged overnight, their hulls scratched and gouged as if by massive claws. Mr. Smith was there, pacing back and forth, muttering to himself. When he saw me, he grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "You didn't see anything last night, did you?" he hissed, his face inches from mine. "You didn't hear anything?" I shook my head, too terrified to speak. He released me and stormed off, leaving me shaken and confused. As the week progressed, the atmosphere at the boat rental became increasingly tense. My co-workers were on edge, speaking in hushed tones and casting nervous glances at Mr. Smith's office. I overheard snippets of conversations about strange noises coming from the boathouse at night and glimpses of shadowy figures moving on the lake after hours. One afternoon, as I was inventorying life jackets in the storage shed, I heard the door slam shut behind me. I spun around to find Mr. Smith blocking the exit, a twisted smile on his face. "I've been watching you," he said, his voice low and guttural. "You're special, you know, not like the others." He took a step toward me, and I instinctively backed away, my heart racing. As he moved into the light streaming through the dusty window, I gasped in horror. His skin seemed to be shifting, rippling as if something was moving beneath the surface. "What's wrong?" he asked, tilting his head at an impossible angle. "Don't you want to see what I really am?" I fumbled behind me, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My hand closed around a boat hook, and I swung it wildly, catching Mr. Smith across the chest. To my shock and revulsion, the hook sank deep into his flesh, but instead of blood, a thick black ichor oozed from the wound. Mr. Smith looked down at the injury with mild curiosity, then back at me. His face began to contort, features melting and reforming into something inhuman. I screamed and shoved past him, bursting out of the shed and sprinting towards my car. As I fumbled with my keys, I heard an unearthly howl from behind me. I glanced back and saw Mr. Smith, or what used to be Mr. Smith, emerging from the shed. His body was elongated, limbs bending at impossible angles, skin now a mottled gray. Those piercing blue eyes, now glowing with an otherworldly light, were fixed on me with predatory intensity. I finally managed to start the car and peeled out of the parking lot, gravel spraying behind me. In my rearview mirror, I saw the thing that was Mr. Smith loping after me with inhuman speed. I pushed the accelerator to the floor, my old Honda protesting as I urged it to go faster. As I sped down the winding lake road, my mind raced. What had I just seen? What was Mr. Smith? The image of his transforming face was seared into my memory, a nightmare made flesh. I didn't slow down until I was miles away from the lake, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I pulled over at a gas station, my whole body shaking. I half expected to see that monstrous form come loping out of the darkness, but the night was quiet save for the distant hum of traffic. I called the police, but my story sounded insane even to my own ears. They took a report but seemed skeptical, promising to send someone to check out the boat rental in the morning. I knew they wouldn't find anything. Whatever Mr. Smith was, I doubted he'd stick around to answer questions. I didn't sleep that night, or for many nights after. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mr. Smith's face melting into that inhuman visage. I jumped at every shadow, convinced that at any moment I'd see those glowing blue eyes staring at me from the darkness. In the days that followed, I learned that the boat rental had mysteriously burned down the night of my escape. The official report cited an electrical fire, but I knew better. Mr. Smith was covering his tracks, erasing any evidence of what had happened there. I tried to move on with my life, to forget about that terrifying summer job, but the memories lingered, surfacing in nightmares and panic attacks. I found myself obsessively researching local legends and folklore, searching for any explanation for what I'd witnessed. But nothing I found could fully explain the horror of what Mr. Smith had become. Years have passed, and I've never returned to Lake Serenity. Sometimes when I'm driving at night and catch a glimpse of glowing eyes in my rearview mirror, my heart stops for a moment. Is it just an animal reflecting my headlights, or something more sinister. I don't know what Mr. Smith really was, or if he's still out there somewhere. But I do know that the world is a stranger and more terrifying place than most people realize. There are things lurking in the shadows, wearing human faces, waiting for the right moment to reveal their true nature. So if you're ever at a lakeside boat rental and the owner seems a little off, trust your instincts. And whatever you do, don't stay after dark. You never know what might be watching you from the shadows, waiting to show you what it really is. The cabin was about a 3-hour drive from campus, nestled in a densely wooded area surrounding a picturesque lake. As I pulled up the gravel driveway, I was immediately struck by how peaceful and serene it all looked. The cabin itself was rustic but charming, all weathered wood and cozy furnishings inside. I spent that first day just settling in and enjoying the quiet. I went for a walk along the lakeshore, did some reading on the back porch, and treated myself to an early night's sleep. It was exactly the kind of relaxation I'd been craving. The next morning, I woke up early, feeling refreshed. I made some coffee and took it out onto the porch to watch the sunrise over the lake. That's when I first noticed the other cabin across the water. It was partially obscured by trees, but I could make out a similar rustic structure on the opposite shore. I hadn't realized there were other cabins so close by, but I didn't think much of it at the time. As the day went on, I kept catching glimpses of movement over there, curtains shifting, a door opening and closing. I assumed it was just another vacationer enjoying some time at the lake, but something about it made me uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to brush it off and focus on relaxing. I went for a swim, did some more reading, and started a puzzle I'd brought along. But every time I looked out the window, my eyes were drawn to that cabin across the lake. A couple times I could have sworn I saw the glint of binoculars or a camera lens, but it was too far to be certain. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The soft lapping of the lake water against the shore that had been so soothing the night before now seemed ominous. Every creak of the old cabin made me jump. I kept imagining I heard footsteps outside. When morning finally came, I seriously considered packing up and heading back to campus early, but I talked myself out of it. I was just being paranoid, letting my imagination run wild in the quiet isolation. I decided to head into the nearest town, about 30 minutes away, to pick up some groceries and maybe chat with some locals to ease my nerves. The trip helped calm me down. The town was small but quaint, with friendly people who were happy to chat with a visitor. I lingered longer than necessary, browsing shops and having lunch at a little diner. By the time I got back to the cabin that afternoon, I was feeling much better. But as I was unloading groceries from my car, I glanced across the lake and froze. There was definitely someone over there, standing on their porch, staring directly at me. I couldn't make out any details at that distance, but the silhouette was unmistakable. As soon as they realized I'd spotted them, they quickly ducked back inside. My heart was pounding. I hurried to get everything inside and locked the door behind me. This was more than just paranoia now. Someone was definitely watching me. But why? What did they want? I spent the rest of the day peeking out windows, jumping at every sound. As night fell, I made sure every door and window was securely locked. I even pushed some furniture in front of the doors for good measure. Sleep was out of the question. Around 2 a.m. I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch. Slow, methodical steps circling the cabin. I was frozen in terror, hardly daring to breathe. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the steps receded. I didn't relax until the sun came up. In the light of day, I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just leave. What if this person followed me? What if they did this to every renter who came to the cabin? I needed evidence to take to the police. I spent the morning trying to discreetly photograph the other cabin, hoping to catch a glimpse of my stalker. But there was no movement over there at all now. Had they left? Or were they just lying in wait? Finally, I worked up the courage to get in my car and drive around the lake. I had to know what I was dealing with. As I approached the other cabin, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely steer. I parked a little ways down the road and cautiously approached on foot. The cabin looked deserted. No car in the driveway, no signs of life. I crept up to a window and peered inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. An entire wall was covered in photos of me, hundreds of them. Me arriving at the cabin, me swimming in the lake, me reading on the porch, close-ups taken with a powerful zoom lens, and disturbingly, several taken through the cabin windows while I was inside. But that wasn't the worst part. Mixed in with the photos were newspaper clippings, missing person reports, all young women who'd rented this same cabin over the past few years, women who had never been seen again. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. I had to get out of here. I had to call the police, but as I turned to run, I came face to face with him, the man from the photos, my stalker. He smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. "I've been waiting for you," he said calmly, raising a hand that held a wicked-looking hunting knife. I screamed and ran. I've never run so fast in my life. I could hear him behind me, crashing through the underbrush. I made it to my car, fumbling with the keys as I threw myself inside. As I peeled out onto the road, I saw him emerge from the trees in my rearview mirror. I drove straight to the police station in town, sobbing and barely able to form coherent sentences as I told them what had happened. They took me seriously, thank God. Within the hour, a whole team of officers was headed out to the cabins. They found the photo wall, just as I'd described. They found evidence linking him to at least 3 of the missing women. But they didn't find him. Somehow he'd managed to disappear into the woods. It's been 6 months, and they still haven't caught him. I've been in therapy, trying to process it all. But I still have nightmares. I still feel watched sometimes. And I know I'll never feel truly safe again. Not until they find him. So if you're planning a quiet getaway in a secluded cabin this year, please be careful. You never know who might be watching from across the lake.